context, I'm a female and 20 years old. Started an OnlyFans account over the summer to support myself through school, and things are great until I posted my Amazon wish list. Amazon doesn't release your address to people who gift you items, but third-party sellers can. And that's where I went wrong. By the way, not trying to promote it here, this is a very frightening story and I felt like it should be shared. In late July, I got a puppy. One night around 2 a.m., I took him outside to go to the bathroom. While he was doing his business, I noticed a car parked outside of my family home. I saw a figure in the car and couldn't tell if they were looking at me, but I couldn't make out their face because it was pitch black outside. Feeling a bit uneasy, I picked up my puppy to take him back inside. And when I started to move, the car parked in my driveway. I sprinted back inside and locked the door, but they never approached my house. The next morning I went to check the mail and there was an envelope addressed to my OnlyFans name with $20 in it, but no note. I was currently still at home with my parents who had no idea about my OnlyFans account, so I didn't mention it to them. A week later I moved back to my college town to get ready to start school. At this time I had stopped posting for the time being until I could figure out how they got my address. I've watched enough crime shows to know there's a possibility I could be in danger. I live in a duplex with a gated parking lot, for reference. One morning, I was planning on vlogging my trip to Target, because I was planning on starting a YouTube channel in the near future since OnlyFans felt unsafe. When I got to my car, it had been ransacked and my vlogging camera was missing. I know it's my fault for leaving it in my car, but I was using it the night before, and since I live in a gated area, I didn't think it would be unsafe. It wasn't in plain sight either. I had hidden it inside of my glove box. I used that camera to film my content, and the SD card that was in there had all of my unreleased photos/videos. I know they stole it just for the SD card. Anyways, this is where the story gets weird. There are cameras outside in the parking lot, so we were able to catch the person break into my car and find the camera. And they didn't touch any of the other 7 cars on the lot. They know which car was mine, which suggests they had been watching me for a bit. After they got the camera, they walked around the duplex, until stopping near my window. My bedroom faces an outside street and my blinds are broken, so it's very easy to see in. I have a curtain, but it doesn't cover my window all the way. This person watched me sleep for an hour or so. I have no idea why they didn't try to break in, but thank God they didn't. This person then sold the camera to a pawn shop, and since I knew the serial number, the police were able to find it. However, my SD card was still missing. I believe the police are still trying to track them down, but I have broken my lease and moved to a new place, so hopefully that will keep me safe. Hey guy who terrorized me at home and apartment and stole my camera, let's not meet. So this story starts on a Sunday night. I'm just up in my room watching YouTube videos and also getting to work on my animations. A couple minutes go by and my sister calls me down. She tells me to lock my door because there was a man on the run. At first I was scared because I didn't have much information on this man, who was running from the police, so I had assumed that he was either a serial killer on the loose, or a predator, breaking into people's homes and doing vile things to them. My sister left to go somewhere and I was left home alone until my mom got back from work meeting. The only defense my mom had was a rifle under her bed, but I didn't know how to use it properly, and my mom isn't very fond of me carrying a firearm of hers without her parental advision. So I was sitting in my room paranoid as hell because I didn't have much information about this dangerous man, and I had fears of dying young or being violated. I called my dad for about 14 to 60 minutes because I was scared, and I didn't want anything to happen to me. So I stayed on the line with him, and my voice was shaking the whole time, while I was telling my dad that I didn't feel safe, and that I didn't want anything bad happening to me. I had a box of kitty litter that was heavy enough to knock any intruder unconscious, so I stood at the top of my steps and had myself prepared. I waited until my mom got home, and when she got home, she told me everything. Apparently, there was a druggie or drug dealer who had a bag of heroin in his car, and he had a gun. And the thought of that even scared me. I sat upstairs having the scariest and worst feeling I ever had. Although nothing happened to me, I hope that whoever was on the run with drugs, heroin, had a pistol on him, was locked up, and away from me, and causing no harm to anybody. I just want to leave on a final note by saying, heroin drug dealer who had a gun making me paranoid for my life, let's not meet. When I was about 16, 9 years ago, my family was living in a suburban area outside of LA. It was a nice neighborhood, kids rode their bikes in a group, parents waved to each other and helped keep an eye out on people's houses. You could join a barbecue if you walked by it at the right time. Well, my dad was working nights at a hospital in the city, and that left myself, female and 16, and my mom, who was 36, and my sister, who was 12, and my brother 8 at home at night, from 6:30 p.m. to around 7:30 a.m. the next day. One night we were cooking, listening to music, and just all around having a good night, and everyone's in bed by 9. I'm woken up to the sound of our front door being rattled, and my mom calling my dad like he is home. Our house was laid out like this. There's a front door and a small entranceway, and the right side wall, facing the door from outside, was my brother's room. Myself and my sister were on the other side of him, and the doorway leading into our dining room. My mom's house was off from the living room towards the back of the house, so they typically turned on lights to come by our rooms. It wasn't all that uncommon for my dad to get let off of a shift a few hours early, and end up home before 7. My front door was frosted glass, and in the middle that was clear enough we could see whoever was at the door. It was an old and a little off, so typically you had to put a little force into opening the door, even if it's unlocked. This part my mom filled in. She'd gotten up, also hearing the door, and thought my dad was home, as I did. However, upon calling out to my dad to confirm and turning on the light switch, whoever it was at the door froze and noticeably jumped. She had still been walking closer to the door to open it to help him, still half asleep, when she realized that the man in the doorway was as tall as my dad, but he had a full head of hair, as well as an outline not matching the familiar outline of my dad coming home in scrubs. This man was wider than my dad, and once he could see my mom in the doorway, he started not only turning the knob, but throwing himself against the frosted glass. Okay, back to what I know. I don't know what kept me from rolling over and going back to bed, but in the next few seconds I heard my mom scream, and sat up in time to hear the footsteps and see her as she disappeared into the bedroom to come back out with a revolver my dad had bought for her birthday. At this point I had rolled over and checked my cell phone quickly to see if it was 1:30 in the morning, and had dialed 911 while my mom was pointing the gun at whoever was at the door, trying to force their way inside. "Stop, or I'll shoot you! I'm on the phone with the police, and they're on their way. I will use force if you enter my home." My mom was screaming at this huge man at the door who, after hearing her for the second time and third time, finally stepped back from the door and was just staring at our shapes from the outside of the frosted glass. After a moment's thought, he seemed to like his chances because he had stepped forward again, and only ran once my mom pulled the pin back and repeated what she had been saying, adding that she might decide not to even wait for him to be inside. He ran off, as I mentioned, and I stayed on the phone with 911 as my mom stood at the doorway, her gun still in both of her hands, aimed at the door the way my dad had taught her to hold it, just the weekend before we had all gone to the range. It was only a moment after the man had fled that 2 uniformed officers filled the doorway the man had just been in, and when they knocked I realized, after she didn't respond to them identifying themselves, however terrified my mother was, her voice shook as she told the officers that she had a weapon, but that she wanted to hear their badge numbers before she would open the door, so I can confirm with the dispatcher. Once they did, she opened the revolver and unloaded it, putting it on the table and crying as I opened the door for the police. They took our statements, had several patrol cars out looking, and found him a few hours later 6 blocks from our house. However, he had made it into the residence he was trying to break into, and they caught him in the middle of robbing the retired couple he had knocked unconscious. So, home invader, let's not meet. This happened 2 years ago, August 11th, 2018. And since the anniversary just passed, I thought I should finally share the story. My fiance and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground, about a half hour from where we live. For reference, my fiance is black. We live in a predominantly white, conservative, and racist area. This is important for later. On our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside ours to the right was occupied, but the one on the left was not. The campers are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the same exact spot the year before. Needless to say, we were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in the woods. The first night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. Now back to the main event. On August 11th, we spent the day at the battlefields at a town over with my family. They'd all been invited to join us for the day by my fiance as a surprise for me while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family until the evening, about 6 p.m., before heading back to our campsite. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been in our tent. Our blankets had been thrown around, clothes were on the floor, and my backpack had been rearranged and I was missing underwear. But hey, we were stupid 19-year-olds and decided that since whoever had bursted in had left and hadn't taken anything important, it was fine and they wouldn't come back. So we set up our campfire and set out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes and celebrating our engagement. Around 9:30 p.m., we put out our fire and decided to go into our tent for the night to celebrate a little more. Nothing too loud or obnoxious. Immediately after we finished, we started to hear the noises outside of our tent again. But this time, we focused in. We could hear clear footsteps at one point, a man whispering. We looked at each other and our eyes got wide. Someone was definitely walking outside of our tent. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps, and we heard whispering again. Shit, make that 2 men walking around our tent. And as if we had the ability to read minds, my fiance said, I have to go to the bathroom. And I agreed. The bathroom was up the hill from our site. Most people who were in the lower sites, like ours, drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now here's the part I still get chills thinking about. We got up and were getting dressed. My fiance had just turned on the light in our tent and put his blinders on when a man spoke directly to us from right outside the tent. What are you doing? I can't even describe how malicious and menacing the voice sounded. It was clearly directed at us, and he had said it with a snicker. He was watching us through the walls of the tent. Again, for this part, we were stupid 19-year-olds, so we decided to just run it for the car. My fiance grabbed his pocket knife and his keys and stepped out of the tent. He pulled me with him and we ran like hell to the car. I heard the footsteps running behind us and then turning and running up to another campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We talked about sleeping in the car or driving into the town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to our campsite and began packing everything into the car. At this point, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us thought possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed in 5 minutes and hopped into the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the drive and grabbed our nameplate, which had my full name on it, off of the post. As we pulled out of the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time. Stalking through the woods onto the campsite were two tall white men. I realized that these were the same two men who had been driving past our campsite the whole time we were there, just glaring at us and muttering to each other. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other was wearing a Confederate flag tank top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and at the ready. They turned when they saw our car drive away, and one started to make chase, until the other stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiled the most terrifying smile at me, and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest, hardest to follow roads, and called my dad, so he'd know that we were coming. We told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off, as us being paranoid, so I never told anyone else besides all of you now. I am convinced to this day that this was going to be a racially motivated attack. The campground was not heavily populated, and my fiancé was the only non-white person at any of the campsites. It was no accident that the two men who had been shadowing us since our arrival, and wore Confederate flags, and had one on their truck, decided to target the interracial couple. I still get cold chills when I think about how close we were to being killed, or seriously hurt that night, and just how lucky we were that our reckless plan to just make a run for it worked. So those men who stalked our campsite with the hunting knives, let's not meet. When I was 25, there was a short time I was staying at my aunt's. It was her, my two cousins, and I. She lives in a nice apartment complex, and her unit is on the lower level. Her living room has a lot of windows that she keeps open for fresh air, and for her cats to watch people. Her unit happens to be on the corner near a grassy courtyard path. When I had first moved in, I noticed a man who gave me a off vibe. My cousins and aunt said that he lived upstairs and 2 units over, recovering from hard drugs that permanently messed him up. His parents paid for him to stay there, as they didn't want him with them. They also said other than hearing him mumble and say weird things, no one had ever had an issue. My aunt works nights and leaves at 3 a.m. My younger cousin works nights and leaves at 2 a.m. They usually left my same age cousin and I, the only two there, until we leave for work around 8. For context, it is a very open living room to dining room plan. My aunt always has people staying over, so she has a second couch in the dining room, in place of a table. This is where I slept. She stayed on the one in the living room. My aunt also has never been one to lock her doors, until this incident. One night I'm on the phone trying to sleep at about 1 a.m., and I hear a man yelling. He's yelling, "Don't shoot!" and banging on the door to the right of ours. 2 male college students live there, and just told him he had the wrong apartment and to leave. He says, "Sorry," and walks off. I'm looking through the kitchen window, which is in the direct line of sight from my couch bed, and it's the weird neighbor who sees me and grins. He then walks back to his house. I was unsettled, but not enough to wake anyone else up over it. I told my family nonchalantly the next day in a LOL, that was weird way. My cousins and I watch a movie and head off to bed. I have a very hard time staying asleep, but I woke up this time to a feeling of someone watching me. I check my phone and it's around 3:30 a.m., so I know it's not my aunt or cousin. I sit up and figure I'll go watch TV on my aunt's couch, since she was already gone. That feeling gets stronger as I'm in the living room. Then I see a shadow of a person standing still in the glass courtyard looking in. I froze. I immediately go back to my couch and get my phone. As I do, the person is gone. I am now trying to calm myself down and think of waking my cousin up, when I hear the creepy man's voice. He is now at the kitchen window, which looks out directly in front of her front door. I drop to the floor out of the line of sight, and start frantically trying to call my cousin. The man is now saying things at the window/front door like, I'm not gonna hurt you. And I'm unarmed. Over and over again. His face is up against the window. Then he starts talking about wanting to pet the cats he saw through the window. I can't get a hold of my cousins. It's been 20 minutes of this, and at this point, in this completely clown shit situation, I didn't have many options. I could jump up and run for a knife, but I'd need to go to the kitchen. I could try to respond and ask him to leave, but I've learned when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. I now hear him knocking and knocking while repeating his nonsense. I'm doing that ridiculously looking army crawl snake slither across the floor down the hall now. I see the door handle start to turn. I'm about to jump up when my cousin burst out of his room directly across from the front door. Now, he's not the biggest guy, but boy was he intimidatingly mad at the circus show taking place at his front door. He starts yelling at the guy that he needs to get the fuck off his porch, and that he's calling the cops. The man tries to say, I'm unarmed. I'm not going to hurt you. You don't need to be afraid. My cousin goes off and yells, that's fucking dandy. It's 4 a.m. You need to leave, or I'll call the cops. What the fuck is wrong with you? So the guy backs up with his hands in the air and leaves. Needless to say, we didn't go back to sleep. My aunt was called, who called the apartment manager. The next day when she came home from work, his parents were there packing and moving boxes in the truck from his place. Maybe he was trying to get me to open the door by seemingly friendly. Maybe he had a bad trip and really wanted to pet my cat to feel better. We will never know. I'm not sure how to best get this out there, so I'm going to start off with some background on where I'm from. I grew up in a small town with no more than a few stoplights, and a few thousand residents in the Great Basin Desert of the western US. For those that have never been, you cannot begin to understand just how vast and isolated you become in my home state. It is a breeding ground for strange people to hide out from the law, keep to themselves, and do whatever it is they want to remain secret. As someone who frequently spends days exploring isolated, vast stretches of desert, hours away from self-service in some cases, I unfortunately have a few stories where I was held at gunpoint or thought I was going to be taken, but those are for another time. This is my earliest encounter with someone I wish I never met. The valley where the story takes place is one where they found a family murdered, just a few months prior to my encounter. I didn't know this at the time, and while probably not connected, it gives you a feel for what happens in the desert. I was roughly 12 at the time, 22 male now, and was with my mom and 3 younger brothers. My dad and uncle were prospecting for gold, and we got bored, so we thought we'd go for a hike down into the valley, into an abandoned miner shack, probably 2 miles away. No biggie. We've done this many times to pass the time, and it's cool to see the old ruins. Note, my dad and uncle had their pistols. We didn't. We get down there with no issue, and the shack looks clearly abandoned and in disrepair. It looks to be from the early 1930s, and is kind of resting on a small hill, with dirt road leading to it. We go inside to explore and all is good, till I see on one of the old shelves, brand new canned goods, fresh pepper wrappers and all. I thought to myself that this was odd, but figured some backpackers must have left them for the next guy. Boy, was I wrong. We kept exploring this house until I come into a room, and I see something that I will forever remember. That feeling you get when you instantly know something is horribly wrong. That struck me pretty hard. That room had a fresh house cat hung from the rafters of the ceiling, with its abdomen slit open, intestines hanging out. It had to have only been a few days old. I never let my mom or brothers see it. I just ran to the room where they were in and said we have to go now. I just said I had a bad feeling because of those cans. We get out of the house and we're about 50 feet away when my brother insists that he needs to go to the bathroom. I didn't tell them what I saw because I knew it'd freak them out, and he just had to go. So here we are. A baseball throws away from this house, and my brother is going to the bathroom. Just as he finishes, from the backside of the hill of the shack, it comes an old white beat-up van, and I remember thinking that this is it. I will never see my dad again. They'll never know what happens to us. Out of the van, I remember vividly seeing 4 men step out and look into our general direction. I picked up my youngest brother and my mom, and the older 2 brothers all took off running. I never felt more scared in my life. I didn't dare look back to see if they were trailing after us. I couldn't make myself. After what feels like forever, we finally got out of the valley and met up with my dad and uncle. We tell them our story and we get the hell out of there. Till this day, I still can't help but wonder if I'd be alive today had I not seen the dead cat before those guys got to the shack. So, to the men mutilating cats in the desert, let's not ever meet again. At the time, I was 17, and I was living for a few years in a small house with my mom after my parents divorced 6 years ago. The house wasn't huge, but we had 1 floor with our bedrooms and a small garden. We also have a dog who isn't really scary. It's one of those small dogs with a lot of hair. His biggest default is that he barks a lot during the day, every time someone is close from the garden. That annoyed me and my neighbors a lot. It's important to notice that my dog never barks at night and always sleeps in my bed with me. Anyways, one time in the middle of the night, I had a dream where I heard a constant dog barking. In my dream, I felt like it lasted 1,000 years, but it only lasted for a few seconds. When I woke up out of that nightmare, I didn't feel the weight of my dog on my feet. It felt like something was wrong, and then I realized my dog was actually barking and growling. I didn't understand what was happening. I just looked for my dog and saw him on the top of the stairs. His head turned towards the front door. The door opening the garage was actually on the side of the front door. I jumped out of my bed and rushed to the top of the stairs where my dog was. There was the shadow of a man standing just at the bottom of the stairs, next to the front door. I wasn't even able to shout. I just took my dog in my arms by reflex and ran towards my mom's room. My mom was just waking up. She takes medication to sleep, so it's very hard to wake her up. Thank God. The door of her bedroom can be locked with a key. Even though I was shaking like hell, I locked the door. My mom understood what was happening when we heard footsteps coming from the stairs. We froze in a corner of her bedroom, and she grabbed her phone to call the police. While we were trying to reach the cops, the guy started shaking the door handle, and then punching the door. After a moment, he stopped, and this psycho laughed. That's when my mom and I had the good idea of shouting, "I called the police, get out!" After a moment, we heard him going down the stairs, still laughing. We didn't dare to move until we heard the police officers. When they arrived, no one was there. In the living room, on the table, there was a note that he wrote, "See you soon." They said later that the guy apparently got in and out by the garage, which has a back door that at the time we always left open. Immediately after that, we went living with my grandparents for a while and moved out into a new house a couple of months later. We never heard of this guy again, but we always checked every door is locked before going to bed, and I have trouble falling asleep ever since. For almost a year after, I waited until it was 4 a.m. to go to sleep, just to be sure he didn't find us, or try to sneak into our home again. Since the moment I started working at this restaurant 6 months ago, The alleyway behind the restaurant has always given me an uncomfortable feeling. To gain a layout of this restaurant, it's located in the middle of downtown, 5 minutes from the Mexican-US border, since we're located into the tip of Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. The alley itself is not located right behind the establishment. You just walk past its patio, then past our garage until you reach the side back door. That you have to prop open, as the door locks behind you once it's closed. During the day, I'll usually see people walking back and forth across the alley. When I go to take out the trash, it's typically a safe location, though it is also prominent for its homeless population. They're usually harmless, despite a few that are noticeably mentally ill. My colleagues have even gotten to know a few and have given leftovers whenever possible. I work as part of the kitchen staff at this restaurant, and most of the time we'll work past 10 p.m. At night my boss usually never lets the women take out the trash, just to be safe, especially a petite 5-foot Hispanic, 28-year-old female. Anyways, since the quarantine started, our kitchen staff has become quite small, so I'll usually help take out the trash with one of the other men working. This night was pretty slow, and my fellow coworkers and I were encouraged to clean up and leave early, at around 9:45. I decided to get 2 of the slightly full trash bags and take them out back myself, assuming someone will see my actions and take the other 2 after me. As I walked past the patio to the garage, my gut began to fluster. I got to the back door and paused. Maybe you should wait, I told myself, but the smell protruding from the bags was nauseating. I pushed the door and propped it open with a brick we usually kept nearby. The alley was dark and silent. The air felt menacing. The only light illuminating was from the bulb above the door. I walked quickly to the bins and lifted up the top and dumped the trash. Then slowly, a man stood up from the other side of the dumpster. He wasn't very big, but he looked a lot older. He was sweating, but his demeanor seemed agitated. He must have been crouching and waiting for some time. I jumped back, holding my hands above my heart. That seemed to be pulsing through my chest. The man looked at me, eyeing me as my steps moved backwards. He shook his head, motioning me to stop. He was far too close for me to outrun him. I looked at his bushy dark brows and dark black eyes. Most of him were still cloaked in the night that surrounded us. His clothes didn't look homeless, but I still assumed he was, since it's common for them to be out here at this hour, usually waiting for food. I told him I have no leftovers, but he shook his head again and took out a medium-sized knife. My eyes widened as I took in a breath. The following exchange took place in Spanish, but I'll translate. I don't have my purse. I was working. I'm still working. Just come with me, he said, using his knife as a pointer. My mouth grimaced. Having no idea where this small amount of courage came from, I said, "My friend is coming right now with the rest of the trash." "No, come now," he said, more harried, and stepped closer, and I stepped back again, speaking again with a little more tenacity. "They all saw me come over here. There's more trash, and he's coming right now. He's outside right now. I just need to yell." "You are not going to scream. I'll gut you." To this day, I don't know what came over me, but I replied with, "Mírame," or "watch me." We looked at each other, daring each other. Then we both heard footsteps coming from the inside of the garage, and he ran past me. I stood there breathing again. I don't even know. I was holding my breath until I turned to see my friend, John, come out of the door. "We're almost done over." He stopped after seeing my face. "What happened?" I explained everything as tears ran down my face. My friend decided to run down the alley to try to catch him, even though I told him not to, and that he's gone by now. It was about 5 minutes until he came back. John relayed to me that no one was around, except for some homeless guys we were familiar with. He asked them if they had saw anyone running from the alleyway, and they said yeah, but they didn't recognize the man, and he took off in the opposite direction towards the border. John took me back inside and told their boss what had happened. They called the cops, whose station was pretty close by. They sent someone to patrol the area and gather a description from me, which I gave. My boss let me leave early, and John walked me to my car. He told me it's too bad we don't keep a camera back there. It would have been cool to see how I handled the guy. I smiled slightly, but my stomach was still in knots. He looked at me and apologized. I moved my hand to stop him and told him that I'll be fine. Fortunately, I still work there, but I've been excused from trash duty from now on. Obviously, they never found him. I don't want to think about what would have happened to me if I was more compliant. Something gave me the courage to argue back at him, and thank goodness that my friend came out just in time. So, man waiting behind the dumpster, I hope we never meet again. This happened about 6 years ago. A little info about myself. I'm a 23-year-old female. I'm also very small. I'm 4'11" and weigh 95 pounds soaking wet. No, I don't have an eating disorder. My 11th grade year of high school is when this event took place. It was within the first 2 weeks of school, and I was a bus rider. We had a new bus driver. Me being a very social person, I always thanked him for his service, and always was super nice to him, and I believe that's where I messed up. One day after school, I was riding the bus. I was always one of the first to be dropped off, so when I realized I'd been on the bus for an extra 10 minutes, I was a little curious and just chalked it up to the fact that the bus routes get changed all the time. At this point, I'd been on the bus for about 30 minutes, and there's 2 kids left on the bus. An old friend of mine and, of course, myself. This friend of mine lived in a very remote location, and there was absolutely no cell service out there. So when we dropped her off, I couldn't call my parents to let them know what was happening. My friend tried really hard to convince me to get off at her stop. Little did I know, I should have listened. As we were leaving this area, the bus driver pulls into a cemetery and told me to look out of my window. When I did, I saw a torn to shred baby deer. My whole body went into a shutdown mode. I didn't know what to do. My initial reaction was to pull out my phone and call my parents. When I remembered I had no signal, I immediately got up and ran to the back of the bus. Keep in mind that I'm the only kid on this bus. We sat by that deer for a good 10 minutes, and the whole time in the back, my blood is absolutely boiling. It was everything in me not to run off that bus and look for help. When we started to leave, he just started talking about random stuff, like how he loves his wife and loves his new job as a bus driver. The whole time, he's barely paying attention to the road. I get on my phone and go to the Google Maps. Thank God they worked even without service. I realized my house was 50 minutes from where we were, and I was super excited to be going home soon. Boy, was I wrong. This jackass then decides to take a shit ton of back roads and kept talking to me. All the while, I'm sitting in silence with no service on my phone. So about 20 to 25 minutes later, I start seeing landmarks that are around my neighborhood. I look down and there's service on my phone. I immediately call my dad and he doesn't answer. Not even 2 minutes later, we pull into my neighborhood, and he drops me off at my house. I wanted to run, but for some reason I just stood in my yard and stared at him, frozen in fear. Eventually he pulled off, and when he did, I took off running into my house. My parents were in their room freaking out about where I was. My mom started grilling me about where I was and what I was doing. I got out of school at 2:15, and I got home around 4:45-ish on a normal day. I would get home at like 2:30, so my mom was very upset. My dad's phone was dead because he tried to call so many times. I began to cry and I told them everything that had happened. My dad was furious and called my school. and used my mom's phone to record the whole conversation between my dad and the principal and myself. My principal was extremely pissed off about what had just taken place, as was my dad. My mother was just cuddling me, asking me if I was okay, and if anything else happened. I didn't go back to school for about 2 days. There was no formal investigation. The school handled it themselves. The bus driver denied everything, and when they checked the camera footage, the camera happened to be covered by a sticker or something of the sort. Thankfully, nobody believed the bus driver, and he was fired. I haven't rode a bus ever since. I know this isn't as creepy as most of the stories, but it's mine, and it's still the most bone-chilling experience I ever had. When I was about 6 years old, me and my family were on a camping trip, and just for reference, this was around 2000 in the Bay Area, California. Anyways, one night we were standing around outside the tent, very late at night or early in the morning. It was definitely past my bedtime, but I was glad to stay up late. I'm not sure what we were doing. I'm pretty sure we were just standing around outside the tent talking. But what happened next I remember very clearly. I saw a bright, flashing light out of the corner of my eye. I looked up to see a brilliant, colorful light streak through the sky like a meteor. It rapidly flashed through every color, like one of those color-changing LEDs, but much, much faster. I've never seen anything else like it. Everyone stared in awe as we watched this brilliant object streak across the sky, and a few seconds later it disappeared. I don't really recall exactly how we reacted, but I'm pretty certain we were astonished. If I had to guess what was said, it would probably be along the lines of, "Wow, did you see that? Oh, what the heck was it? Was it a UFO?" I think we went to bed shortly after that. Thinking about what we'd seen, the next morning we were driving in the car and listening to the radio. Probably one of those morning shows, and the DJ happened to mention that there had been a satellite that had re-entered the atmosphere late last night. I guess they said that so anyone who had seen it would know what it was. When I saw it, I instantly thought it was a UFO, so I guess I held on to that explanation and didn't entirely believe the satellite re-entry story. But after looking up some videos and even seeing many spectacular examples of satellite re-entries, I believe it's like that's what I saw. But what I remember seeing was much more vivid and colorful than any of the ones I've seen on video. Even after all these years, I know that what I saw will always stick with me.
So, I'm employed as a policeman, and I work the night shift in a tiny little town. The population here barely breaks 1,000. Needless to say, I know the town well enough to be able to tell when something is off. Near the center of the town, there is an old school they used before they built the new elementary and high schools. The building is listed as a historical site, and the building can't be demolished, but due to asbestos, renovations would cost the town too much to be worth the work. This school sits within feet of the public library, and behind sits the town's fairground. It isn't an official fairground, but every year, they had bull rigging and small child shows they put on in the summer. With all of those details out of the way, I will explain what happened. I noticed the back light to the library on, which is not normal since it wasn't all night. And it is not a motion light. So I parked on the north side of the old school grounds. I walked through the fence and had to pass the school to get to the library. I would stop every few feet and listen because the gravel was so loud. When I stopped the second or third time, I thought I heard a squeal in the school, just like a door. And at first, I didn't think anything of it, since I figured I was hearing things. The town just replaced all the windows in this building, so I thought I wouldn't hear the inside. When I investigated the light and found all the doors locked, I was walking back around to my car. As I walked by the school again, I heard a noise in the building again, and I stopped. I listened and shined my light, noticing a basement window was broken out. So when I walked up to the window, I looked down and I didn't see anything. I kept walking and I heard the squeal again. It reminded me of those bathroom doors in schools that the hinges always squealed really loud and echoed. When I came around the corner, I saw two cats roughhousing in the dirt. They stopped to watch me, and then both of them turned and looked at the door. I couldn't see myself because it was around another corner. One hissed and they both bolted away from the school, which put me on edge. I know this school is absolutely not in use, nor are there any plans to use the school anytime soon. Also, the local kids and homeless don't come here, ever. It is a landmark the city as a whole really admires, and has been an issue with breaking and entering for a long time. So when I came around the corner, I saw the door I walked up to see if the cats had run from. I looked for other animals, but that didn't make sense because they looked up, as if someone was standing in the window of the door, not like they would if there was a raccoon or a dog that ran off without me seeing. When I looked in the window with my light, I could see a gigantic Raggedy Ann painted on the wall, and I assumed this was the kindergarten section or something. And then I stepped back from the door, getting ready to leave, and I heard whistling. It wasn't really loud, but it was loud enough to make me stop. That little voice in the back of my head was talking now and telling me I was just hearing things. But the dude that likes to dump the fear of the unknown told me to get back to the door. So I went back and listened again. And I know it was whistling. Not like the squeak of an animal or object from inside. It got louder. And when I came to the door again, it had a tune, but I don't know how to describe it. So now, thinking someone is in the school, I went around and checked all the doors, including the second floor door. That I had to climb the rusty metal stairs that were more like a death trap. When I couldn't find a way in the school, I checked it all over again. And when I left, I couldn't figure out what it was. The whistling had stopped, and I even hung around outside for a few minutes, without my light on, just watching, figuring if someone was inside. They would eventually need to use a light to get around or back out. But there was nothing. After 20 or so minutes, I got back in my car, circled the block, and parked down the way with my lights off, to watch for someone to come out at some point. But no one did, and there hadn't been any lights inside. I know this story is kind of boring compared to some others, but working nights gets you on edge. And for all the things I know I experienced before, this was in my top 5 bone-chilling moments while working. I wanted to debunk the noise and the cats, but I wouldn't even know where to start with it. Like the title says, I can't explain what happened. Hope you enjoyed reading it, and I hope to share my experiences in the future. A little background on my grandparents. I love them very much, but they were problematic. My grandfather was a hotshot Delta lawyer who was a member of the Citizens Council and had countless mistresses and affairs, but also worked ferociously to desegregate public schools and defend disenfranchised laborers pro bono. My grandmother was vain and hellish to her maids and staff, never paid them equally, and kept a gun in her car so she could pack heat when she ran down my grandfather's girlfriends and threatened them with an inch of their lives. So these two dysfunctional people, very much a product of their times, had 3 children and dominated their little town in Mississippi. They were one of the few wealthy families and wanted to cement their status by buying the oldest and largest houses in town. Located in the heart of the tiny historic district, the house was a 100-year-old Victorian, the cliché of it all, that had stood empty for 20 years and needed a complete overhaul. New roof, new walls, new insulation, you name it. My grandparents bought the house and lived in a rental for 3 years,
while they tore out the asbestos and varnished the wood floors, updating the kitchen and landscaping. They quite literally spent millions on furniture and rugs and paintings while they were waiting for the house to be finished. They moved into the house in 1973, and the first night, they had to call the police twice. Once when they heard loud footsteps walking the upstairs and stomping outside of their bedroom door, and the other when the kitchen door slammed shut on the first floor, shaking the floorboards. Basically, they thought someone had snuck in, evaded the police, and was still lurking around. My grandfather stayed awake all night, convinced that someone was hiding in their house. The sound of footsteps walking up the stairs and stomping outside their bedroom door went on every night for 3 months. My grandmother was the first to acknowledge the presence of the ghost. She quickly learned that it didn't like the electrical appliances. It had a vendetta against her vacuum cleaner in particular. The long hallway that ran through the center of the house on the first floor was called the gallery, and my grandmother had purchased a massive oriental rug to fill the space, and it required constant cleaning. The electrical outlet was on one end of the hallway, and she would plug in the vacuum and start making her way down the gallery. She would never get more than 5 feet down the hall before the vacuum would die, its plug having been ripped out of the socket. She'd go plug it back in, start vacuuming, and a few minutes later would have the same thing happen. Vacuum would die, plug would be laying on the floor. She always swore that she had plenty of slack in the cord length, and that someone did not approve of the noise of the vacuum. There was also an incident where the toaster in the kitchen went missing for a day, and reappeared in the trash can. Their children, my dad and aunt and uncle, all claim they saw a man in the front parlor looking out the window. To this day, my aunt can't talk about the ghost without tearing up a little from nerves. When they left for college, they mostly never stayed in the house except for holidays, and even then, they elected to stay at friends' houses rather than sleep in the house overnight. One day in the mid-1980s, the niece of the original builder, the owner, came to town, and my grandparents invited her over to see the renovations in the house. The visit ended up lasting for hours as the niece, by then very elderly, waxed sentimental on the memories she had of the place and of her uncle. He was a doctor and used the front of the house as an office and exam room, but died of a heart attack in the house when he was in his 50s. Apparently he was well loved, and the town turned out for his funeral, which was also held in the house. The niece told my grandparents that his wife always said that he never left and stayed looking after them. After that visit, things seemed to calm down for the next 6 to 7 years, until I was born. My mom and dad lived in the small town for a few years after my birth, and my grandparents would babysit and kept me overnight when my parents needed a break. I had distinct memories of sleeping in my crib in the upstairs hallway and being checked on by a tall man wearing a vest and long-sleeve white shirt. He'd check his watch and nod before walking away. I brought this up to my grandmother when I was a teenager. She absolutely lost it and went into a meltdown about how ghosts aren't real and that I was making it up to upset her. So I never told her about seeing the man walk out of the greenhouse, or how I saw him in the window at the end of the hallway upstairs when playing in the yard. My dad believed me, however, because the man used to check in on him too. He'd be in bed asleep and wake up to the sound of the door opening slowly and then shutting quickly. Once he told me the background stories of the builder. I was convinced that it was the ghost of the doctor still making his rounds, checking to see if everyone was okay. I never spoke his name aloud, but in my head I referred to the ghost as Dr. W, his given name. And from then on, I began to notice more instances of bizarre activity in the house. Pillows would be rearranged on sofas, doors would be left open when they were previously shut, and the dumb waiter would often rise and fall to different floors in its own accord. But once I left for college, I never saw Dr. W again. My grandparents sold the house when my grandfather began showing signs of early onset dementia. They built a new house out in the country, where he could take walks outside without encountering cars on busy roads. The house they built was massive but slightly smaller than the old Victorian. They moved in without any problems, but quickly realized that they weren't alone in the house. My grandmother told us the same things were happening in the house that occurred 40 years ago, when they moved into the Victorian. Footsteps on the stairs, kitchen appliances terrorized, doors opening and shutting. The activity calmed down after a few months, but my grandmother swore that she saw a shadow moving through the rooms. When my grandfather began to decline, she set up a hospice room for him in the house and hired a nurse to take care of him. He began to see people in the hallway outside of his room, a whole cast of characters. "That man," he said once, pointing at the door, "he's from the house." "What house?" we'd ask. "You know," he'd say, "the doctor." He also saw his mother, a man wearing old-fashioned speculars, a woman holding a loaf of bread, and his sister. But Dr. W was the one who lingered outside of his door watching him die. When he did pass, my grandmother felt someone in the room with him, and my grandfather was very agitated. "Not you," he said, over and over again. "Go away. Get out." I'm not sure why Dr. W chose to follow my grandparents. Maybe he didn't have a choice, but neither of them ever directly acknowledged the ghost in conversation with me. All of the info I have is from my father and aunt. If anyone has any similar experiences, I would love to hear them. This story takes place a few years ago when I was in college, but I was reminded of it after a conversation that I had with my sister. One night during summer break a few years ago, my sister and I went to a bonfire at a friend's house. The whole night was nothing out of the ordinary, just some close friends hanging and sitting around a fire. At one point the fire was dying down a bit, so someone threw a huge piece of cardboard on it. Suddenly, a gust of wind caught the cardboard in a way that caused it to blow upward. I remember looking at the cardboard to make sure that it wasn't about to blow towards me, when I noticed that the fire was burning holes that distinctly looked like eyes and a mouth, with fire coming out of it. It felt silly, but the way it looked when it burned made me feel uneasy. It started to get late, so I decided it was time to drive home. I was on the last road before I got to my house, when my sister and I were talking, and she asked me if I noticed the creepy way that the cardboard burned in the fire. Not long after that, I remembered seeing something from the corner of my eye that looked like it was running towards my car tire. I know I wasn't seeing things because my sister gasped, and I ran off the road to avoid what I assumed was an animal that was feeling brave or suicidal. We looked out of the window to see what was there, and there was nothing. No sign of anything, and the road we were on didn't give any animals any hiding spots or woods nearby to run into. This freaked me out a little bit, but I could see my house, so I shook it off and pulled into the driveway. I'll never be able to understand what happened when I pulled into the driveway truly. I've never felt primal fear like I did in that moment. Everything inside of me was screaming at me not to walk up to my house. I felt so silly. I've lived in this house for years up until this point. I realized I wasn't crazy when my sister asked me if I felt it too. I looked over and I could see the terror in her eyes. We couldn't see anything outside, but I could feel evil watching us. We sat in the car and tried to play it cool and tell her how crazy we're being and that we needed to go inside. Suddenly the lights in my car turned on. I lied and told my sister that I opened the car door a little bit, which caused the lights to turn on, but that was a lie. At this point I was panicking but trying to play it off to keep my sister calm. We finally get out of the car, and for the first time in our adult lives, we clung on to each other like scared children and made our way towards the house.
The house in this story has a front porch light that had been out for over a year, but sometimes we would accidentally flip the switch to turn the light on and forget about it since the light didn't work anyways. That night we were walking up to the house. The light turned on and started flickering. It's never done that. We pushed through the fear and kept on going. We made it to the front steps, and as soon as I hit the first step, my phone started playing music on full blast. I had turned off my music before I had got out of the car. I felt like whatever was in front of my house was tormenting us. It wanted to make itself known, and we felt all of it. Walking on that porch into my front door was only a couple of steps, but that night, it felt so long. I remember feeling terrified to the point of illness. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to cry. But all I could do was keep my eyes on my front door and walk. I couldn't see it, but I know what I felt was on a specific area of my porch. My sister was closest to that spot, and she later told me how she could feel something against her as we walked together into the house. The strangest thing was, as soon as we walked through the porch into the house, I immediately felt better. The fear and the feeling of eyes on me and evil just vanished, and everything felt normal. The porch never felt malicious again after that night, and the light never turned back on. I don't know what was on my porch that night, but I know it wasn't good.
Myself and my partner rented our first house back in 2012. Nothing creepy or particularly off-putting about it. Just a standard terrace house on a street of identical houses in a northern town in England. My partner, now wife, was pregnant at the time, so we needed somewhere to bring up our first child. We chose this one as it was an area we were familiar with, and the rent was affordable. When we moved in, everything was normal. Just a standard house, and we set about getting furnished and all the usual stuff. I used to take my wife to work early in the morning, and I'd drop her off and come back home. The front door opened directly into the living room, and there was a sliding door from this room which went into the kitchen. This had a door going out the back to an enclosed yard, shared with a nearby house, and stairs leading upstairs. There was also a frosted glass window next to the sliding door, which was presumably once a serving hatch, but now just served to let some natural light in, as the sun never got to the front of the house, due to the narrow street and surrounding houses. Within a few weeks of moving in, I developed a weird feeling, like something was watching me through the window. It wasn't overpowering, but it did get to the point whereby I'd actively avoid looking at it out of the corner of my eye, as some part of me was always worried I might see something on the other side looking back. I'd always been deeply skeptical about anything paranormal, so always tried to ignore it or laugh it off as me just being stupid in what was an unfamiliar house. That said, the feeling became stronger, to the point that after dropping my wife at work, I'd come home and catch a few hours on the sofa in the living room, as I didn't want to go into the kitchen and up the stairs to bed. The feeling was definitely the strongest in the kitchen and on the stairs, and the only way I can describe it is it felt predatory, like the constant nagging feeling that something was either watching you or right over your shoulder about to rush you, even though there was nothing there. Things seriously escalated after one particular evening. We were watching a Darren Brown TV show where he was disproving the idea of the paranormal and seances. Part of the show asked you to perform an Ouija board at home, and the premise was that he would lead the responses and tell you what the results you would get, thereby removing any idea of it being anything more than suggestion and parlor trick. My skeptical nature combined with my wife's belief in the paranormal meant that I was keen to go along with this and prove how her beliefs were silly. We started the Ouija board and went along with all the instructions, except we didn't get the results the show said we would. We got something far more sinister. When we asked the name of any spirit, rather than the scripted name we were supposed to get, we got the name Ernest. By this point, I'm laughing, thinking my wife is pranking me. That Ernest is a stupid name to come up with. My wife isn't laughing though, and says we should stop. Thinking that it's all her, I go along with it. Do you like us living here, Ernest? No. Why not, Ernest? What do you think about me? Rogue. Now it's worth mentioning that this confused me. My only experience of the word rogue was various classes in video games. Okay, what do you think of my wife's name? Whore. Wife is getting more upset by this point. It's really quite distressed. We follow the rules and say goodbye. The glass we were using as a planchette goes to goodbye. The board we were using was made out of scraps of paper with letters and numbers, and the usual yes, no, hello, and goodbye on them. As my wife was so freaked out by this, I collected them together, put them in a glass bowl, and took them out to the yard and burned them, partially for her peace of mind, and partially for my own. That night we had gone to bed, and around 20 or so minutes after we got in bed, we heard a loud bang that came from downstairs. I went downstairs to check everything, thinking something may have fallen over, but everything was still in place, so I went back to bed. As we lived in a terrace house, I told my wife it might just be the neighbors banging on a cupboard door, and went back to sleep. The next night we went to bed. Within the first half hour of being in bed, the exact same bang from downstairs. This happened every night, no matter what time we went to bed, whether it was 9 p.m. or 1 a.m. Within half an hour, we heard the same bang, always at least once, sometimes twice. We tried to replicate it. After trying everything, we discovered that a heavy cupboard door in the corner of the kitchen, when open and then let go, made the same exact noise. I was pretty intrigued and keen to find out what it was, as we never had any signs of pest or vermin, and the cupboard was fixed to the wall, about 6 feet off the ground, so I asked my wife to let me set up a camera in the kitchen, recording after we went to bed. She wouldn't let me though, as she said she didn't either want to know or didn't want to antagonize it if it was anything. Things really began to go downhill from here. We would find ourselves arguing over the smallest things, having full-blown shouting arguments for hours over nothing, despite normally being a very chilled person, often accused of being too laid back. I found myself constantly on edge, in a combination of what I can only describe as anger and anxiety. Things didn't happen overnight, and was something that built up slowly within both of us, to the point I didn't notice it was happening until much later. There was no waking up a different person moment, but a slow and subtle change. Despite never having before, I began suffering nightmares on a regular basis. I would have vivid dreams of family members dying in horrific ways, such as being burned alive. I would wake up screaming or in tears, as my wife would have to spend an hour reassuring me that they weren't real and calming me down. The most disturbing thing was, she said she'd waken up and tossed and turned due to being heavily pregnant, and I'd lay there with my eyes wide open, staring blankly, like I was asleep, but with my eyes open. And when she told me to close them, I would, with no other reaction or comment. I absolutely have no recollection of ever doing this, and have never done this at any point before, or since living in that place. The arguments continued and got worse. The regular bang at night continued, and for the overall sense that something was following me, particularly in the kitchen and stairwell, became more and more overpowering. That, despite my best efforts to convince myself I was just being ridiculous, and trying to force myself to walk slowly. It was clearly that flight of stairs 3 steps at a time filled my adrenaline, and my heart pounding in my ears. There was a brief lull in activity in the months or so before our child was born. It was around Christmas, and the arguments had abated, and we seemed to get back to ourselves. I thought we had turned a corner. The nightly bangs persisted, but we'd become so used to it, we would now just look at each other and roll our eyes. My wife told me that the kitchen/living room window and the sense of being watched or followed was something she was experiencing too. Then our little boy was born. Everything was okay for the first week or so, but the atmosphere soon began to change. The sense of anger and anxiety began to creep back in, and we were starting to bicker. The atmosphere was made worse as our newborn baby would just cry constantly, every hour of the day when he was in the house. He'd sleep for 20-minute intervals, and the rest of the time he would spend trying to nurse, win, feed, distract, play. Anything to try and soothe him, but nothing worked. We had him back and forth to hospitals and doctors so many times in the first few months. But inevitably, when we got there, he was calm and sleeping, or giggling happily. The doctors would look at us like we were crazy, and I was beginning to think that I was cracking myself up. But when we got home, the crying would begin again. We would take it in turns and see him at night. But that wasn't helped by the fact I was now apparently doing the weird sleeping with the eyes open thing again. It culminated for me one night when I was laid in bed, waiting for the inevitable cry to start, when I saw a shadow from the corner of my nearest window, and began to slowly move across the fitted wardrobes we had in the room. I initially thought it was being created by the curtains against the headlights of a moving car, slowly down the road, but it wasn't moving right. The best comparison I can make is like that of ink being dropped into water. The room was dark to try and help our boy sleep, but this was darker than the rest of the room, like a very rich black that seemed to have shapes like smoky tendrils coming off of it. I laid and watched as it inched along the cupboards, and then watched it go along a corner and continued on the wall. I knew at this point it wasn't a shadow, as the shadow would have jumped from the wardrobe to the wall, not creep around the corner that was facing the opposite direction to the window. I watched it go out the door and onto the stairs. Now, if this was to happen now, I would have noped straight out of the room, but at the time I remember being oddly memorized by it, and only started to feel any kind of fear after it left the room. I resolved to not tell my wife, as we'd already experienced enough weirdness to be on edge, and the idea that I may have just witnessed a manifestation would probably have upset her even more. It was winter at this point, and the house was constantly cold, not helped by how dark it was due to the sunlight not being able to make its way in. No matter what we tried, we couldn't get the place to maintain a constant, comfortable temperature. One room may be red hot, but the one next to it freezing, despite the heating being set to the same throughout the house. The rooms which experienced hot and cold varied from hour to hour. The temperature would spike in a room and only fall again to uncomfortably cold in the space of half an hour. We had a room thermometer for our baby, and we were having it constantly move it from room to room to try and find one that was relatively normal. Unfortunately, I found the one place in the house where the temperature remained the most stable was the stairs and landing, so I'd find myself having to sit there fighting the rising anxiety to run, because it was the run room where our child could neither be overheating or wrapped in blankets against the cold. Around this time, I remember a dream quite clearly, where I was talking with a woman, no idea who she was, and saying how dark and cold the house was. She asked me if I knew what that meant. I said not. I remembered even now when she said that life needs light to grow. The only thing that can thrive in darkness is death. It may have been my overreactive paranoia or subconscious, but I clearly remember waking up with those words still in my head. Now, when I hear a lot of these stories, I often wonder why people didn't just get out. There's usually an excuse about not wanting to surrender their home and fighting for their house. Well, this wasn't our house. We were renting it, and all the combined problems of weirdness got too much. We decided we had to move. We found a house a few miles away and gave our notice to the place. It was the night before we were due to move in the early hours of the morning. We heard a piercing siren. We had a carbon monoxide alarm and it was going off. We opened all the doors and windows and got outside. My wife and our boy went to my parents', where I waited for the gas engineer to arrive. He arrived and immediately condemned the gas fire we had in the living room, which had started leaking carbon monoxide. It's difficult not to think that without the alarm, we all could have been dead, and the fact it happened on the day we were due to leave. I couldn't shake the idea that the two were linked, and something either wanted us not to leave, or to give us a parting gift. I'd like to say we moved and everything was better overnight. It wasn't. The new house started out okay. The nagging feeling of being followed around slowly crept back. Not as intense, but noticeably there. In the house, we all shared a bedroom, and had a lot of stuff still packed in boxes and generally cluttered in a spare room. One of them was a bouncer for our baby. This was a Fisher-Price frog-type bouncer, and had eyes in the front. When rolled, would play a tune. Around 4 a.m. one morning, the frog tune started going off. I immediately looked in the crib next to our bed thinking our baby might have gotten out somehow, and started playing with it, but he was fast asleep. I did everything I could to get it to go off again, without spinning the eyes, knocking, hitting the floor around it. I tried to tell myself it was maybe the batteries, but this was the only time it had ever happened. We didn't have to change the batteries for the next 2 years or so we had it. The feeling of being watched grew. Only now, it was strongest from a conservation on the back of the property. My wife and I had been through enough by this point, that we were now openly discussing the weird feelings with each other. There were a set of double doors between the kitchen and conservation, and this one particular night my wife asked if I'd close them. I didn't ask why, but did so. About an hour or so later, I decided to go back and have a cigarette. As I opened the doors, the glass-paneled French doors of the conversation were in front of me. It was dark outside, so all I could see in the door was the reflection of the light kitchen behind me. As I walked towards the door, I see in the reflection very clearly a black silhouette of a person run behind me, almost like it had run into the house through the exterior wall and straight through to under the stairs. My first thought was it was someone outside, but as I checked, no one was there. I stood there smoking and thinking and realizing it couldn't have been outside, as the figure had passed behind me and was briefly obscured by my own reflection, so it had to have been in the room behind me. I quickly finished my cigarette and went back inside. I sat there mulling it over before telling my wife the next day, to which she had wanted the door shut as she didn't feel comfortable about that room all day, more so than usual. We had a similar instance a month or so later, which could have ended badly. While driving and pulling onto the motorway, interstate for our American friends, slip road, my wife all of a sudden jumped on the brakes. When I asked what the hell she was doing, she said a dark figure had just run out in front of the car. There was literally no one around as the slip road was in a wooded area, away from any built-up spots or paths. I didn't see this myself as I was in the back of the car with our boy, but my mother-in-law was in the front, and she said she saw it too, and was equally spooked. Gradually since then, the feeling of anxiety and tension subsided. We eventually moved again, mirroring our experience of leaving the last place though. On the day we were moving, we were taking our belongings down the drive to the van, when a roof tile slid off and nearly missed hitting me and my brother-in-law, who was helping us. We moved to a house which, out of any, should have been the most haunted, being built earlier than the others in the 1830s. This house, however, was the most tranquil, and had no such weird atmospheres or happenings. All of this was about 6 or 8 years ago now, and we often walked past the first house, and had seen it come up for rent many times since, so nobody seems to stay there long. The funny thing is, we both said a few times how when we went to see it on the market, we both have a desire to go back. We'd even talk about going for a fake viewing just to walk around the place. We never have, but even the idea that after everything, we still feel the urge to go back is something which the rational part of my brain can't really explain. I'm so tempted to go back through all old census records to see if an Ernest ever lived in that house. But so far, I've resisted the temptation to rake it all over for fear or something setting off again. That, and if finding out that someone did, well, I don't know if I'd like the answer. Thanks for taking the time to go through all this. Has anyone had anything similar? Or can anyone offer an explanation as to what this all might have been?
I want to start off by saying I have never experienced anything visual like this before. If there's any possible explanation, however, I'm not sure how there could be. I would like to hear it. My girlfriend and I are in the process of moving into a basement suite. We still technically reside at our old place across town for another 3 days. Her name is the only one on the lease since we've been having some relationship issues due to work, stress, and personal problems. The basement suite we moved into had been completely gutted, and most of the appliances and flooring replaced, except for the bathroom. It's now a city-legal suite, with its own water heater, etc. Since there had been a massive police investigation done a few months prior, we weren't told much about what had happened here, other than drug-related incidents. I went into the bathroom to do some cleaning yesterday evening, and noticed what looked like blood at the bottom of the radiator. It seemed creepy and I didn't want to touch it just yet, because gross. Anyways, a few hours pass and my girlfriend goes to bed in the bedroom, and I fall asleep on the couch watching TV. I woke up around 4 a.m. to our cat knocking a plant off the windowsill and messing with the blinds. The lights were off, but I have a big blacklight aquarium in the living room, which lit up most of the living room / kitchen area. My girlfriend came out of the room to ask what was going on, and I was all pissed off, half asleep, cleaning dirt off the countertops. She told me to leave it for tomorrow and just come to bed, and then walked away. I stayed up and continued cleaning for maybe 20 minutes, since there was dirt all over this place. This is what freaking terrified me, even thinking about it now. I was in the kitchen wiping down the counters. It was pretty dim, but I could still see. It's now around 4:30 a.m. I turned around towards the garbage can, and my girlfriend is standing in the dark doorway, just staring at me. I couldn't see her face clearly, but it was a 6-foot thin figure, the exact build of my girlfriend. I said, "Sorry if I'm keeping you up. I'm almost done." She just stood there facing me. I figured she was just pissed off since we had been arguing off and on this whole week. I finished what I was doing and walked past her and asked if she was coming to bed. She didn't move. I walked straight into the bedroom and closed the door, and my girlfriend was laying there sleeping. I woke her up by closing the door, and I guess the look on my face scared her enough to make her spring up in bed, wide awake, and ask what happened repeatedly. I started gagging, swearing, and pretty much just lost it for a minute or two. I told her I just saw her in the kitchen, and she said, "Well, yeah, I came out earlier and asked what happened." I told her, no, I just walked past her in the bedroom. She pretty much just went silent, peeked out the door, and nothing was there. We both went to sleep a while later. I don't get strange feelings here at all, which is the weird part. But holy fuck, I have no idea what that thing was last night. And it scared me so bad I almost threw up when I realized my girlfriend had been sleeping that past half hour, and I have no idea what to make of that. Just a little background, I originally come from Ukraine, and I travel a lot all of my life. I studied and lived in England from 12 to around 21 years of age, and now I'm working in Belgium. My mother knew this fortune teller, who was known to be able to diagnose diseases just by holding your hand, as well as predict your future, at least key events. My mother was worried about my future since I had so many opportunities that she took me to see this guy. I had exams coming up, and it was a good way to both distract myself and learn something new. The guy made a total of 7 predictions. I will first mention the one that happened, and the rest that are yet to be. Just to let you know, this guy lives in a tiny village, and never traveled outside of it, nor does he have access to the internet. Anyways, here we go. Number 1. I would get a 82% in my exams. He guessed the exact percent. I wasn't doing very well in my studies at all, and I only started studying probably in the last few months. He put his hands on my forehead and immediately said that I shouldn't worry, as I will get an 82%, which is what I needed to get into university I wanted. That came true and I went to university. Number 2. I have problems with my liver. I was a very healthy kid and I did a lot of sports semi-professionally. In my school at 18 years old, I was in football, rowing, and tennis team. I barely drink and eat properly, and had a very healthy body composition. After he said I was going to have problems with my liver, we went to the doctor and guess what? I had an enlarged and hardened liver. Doctors had no idea what caused it, and to make it normal I had to do a special diet for 2 months. After that it all went back to normal. Number 3. I would travel to Finland for work at 23 years old, but not before then. I had a business trip to Estonia and Finland last December, and guess what? I literally traveled to Finland the day before I turned 24. I had no control over booking the tickets or scheduling this business trip. My management sent me on this mission. I'd never been to Finland, nor any Nordic countries ever. Number 4. At 28, I will have 1,000 employees under my management. It hasn't happened yet. I'm currently trying to work myself up to become a project manager, but still not sure if it's possible for this to happen. Right now I manage around 30 employees, so it's a big jump to 1K. But we will see. Number 5. In my lifetime, I will travel to Russia only twice. It hasn't happened yet. Due to a political climate between Ukraine and Russia, I haven't traveled to Russia ever, although I do want to visit badly. Number 6. I will marry a blonde woman, and we will have 2 daughters. That hasn't happened yet either. It was always a dream of mine to have daughters, not sons. I can't explain why, just always wanted to. I have mostly females in my family, loads of sisters, aunts, and grandmas. So let's see. Number 7. I will move and live in Finland most of my life. Might happen soon. This is quite unbelievable. He said that when he concentrated on my future, he saw the word Suomi around me a lot. At the time, none of us knew what it was. He also said that I would live and probably die in Finland. When I came home and Googled what Suomi is, it turned out to be a language spoken in Finland. And as for working there, when I had a business trip, I made some connections with other colleagues who invited me for some potential working positions. So I might end up moving there sooner rather than later. So that's that. He predicted a lot of things like prostate cancer in early stage from my dad's friend, which saved his life, as well as healing my grandma's depression by one 15-minute talking session. I don't know if there's anything to this guy, but it's sure not just accidents. I thought a long time before posting my story here, or rather 2 that happened to me and one of my colleagues. It's not something scary, but rather something very uncomfortable, and my friends told me it would fit in here. Let's get started. Both stories happened in the summer of 2018, when I was working as a facilitator in a recreation center for children, small sections up to the 1st grade. We were in a kind of park, about 20 minutes away by bus, where we stayed all day before going back to school at about 5 p.m., so that the parents could pick up their children. This park was reserved for us, and therefore nobody else than us. Our managers and those who take care of the canteen are not supposed to be there, especially since around it there was only fields, a forest, and a building site. That was quite far. Now that the context has been set, I begin the first story that happened to my colleague. We had walkie-talkies for the day, which allowed us to reach our managers, the secretary, or the infirmary in case of a problem. But they were returned when it was time to leave, to be recharged during the night. So it was up to the secretary, my colleague, who was the last one to leave around 7 p.m., to put them on charge and then close the shutters and doors and go home. One morning, I think it was around the 8th day, I had been working for a month with the children. We all find ourselves summoned one by one to the office of our leaders, so I go there without really understanding what was going on. I pass in front of the secretary, who doesn't look serene at all, and that worries me a bit. My senior manager asked me if I returned my walkie the day before, or if I knew if someone had taken one. I say that I did return mine, by pointing it out at the charging station, and I explained that I didn't hear anything else. I still ask why I'm being asked this question. Then my manager tells me, the night before at 7 p.m., as she was about to leave, my colleague was closing the shutters when one of the walkie-talkies lit up, and a male voice came on saying, "Hey, beauty of the Isles, you're beautiful when you close those shutters." I had a vile shiver go down my spine, my colleague being the only foreigner on the team. The person who had spoke to her had been looking at her, and really talking to her, and not a hoax. At that time, she had called her roommate who come to pick her up, and left every other day with someone. We never heard from that guy again. Nevertheless, we patrolled for several days to try and notice someone, for our safety, but especially for the children's safety. The second story takes place in the third, and thus the penultimate week of work. It was around 11 a.m. when I got called on the talkie by my manager. She tells me that something very strange has happened. I asked her what it was, and again, I feel the shiver of just anguish. A man had come to the secretary and asked to see me. To see me? Using my first and last name. My manager had gone to see me because she thought it was strange, because nobody is supposed to show up at my workplace. Apart from my parents and friends, nobody knew I was there. This man had then introduced himself as my uncle, and that he had come to pick me up for personal reasons. My manager said that I was not on the site, and that was not true, and that she would let me know that he had come by. According to her, he looked very annoyed and left without giving his name. You could say it was a plausible story, but I only have one uncle, who is my godfather, who doesn't fit the description of the man who came, and to whom I don't talk to at all. Again, I have never heard of this man again, and I've never seen him, but I still have this bad feeling that someone I don't know forged an identity to come and get me. Who knows what would have happened if I had gone. I am grateful to my manager, who knew how to smell the trouble. That was a bit of a long story, maybe not very interesting, but it makes me feel good to talk about it. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye, everyone. I never thought anything like this would have happened to me. Tonight, that might have changed. I live in a rural area north of the UK. About 20 minutes outside of the village I live in is a large complex of abandoned buildings. I haven't ever been able to get a straight answer on what these used to be. Some say an old farm, others say it was a RAF, UK Air Force base. Either way, it's a cool place to explore, and any kid's dream. I'm older now, 18 and male, but I practically grew up here, spending many summers at this place with my groups of mates. We're all older now, so we don't go anymore. I mentioned how many times I've been to the demonstration how comfortable I am with this place. Any creepy feelings usually associated with abandoned buildings have worn off because of how many times I've been here. I should also mention that in all my time visiting this place with my friends,
We have never seen anyone else there. It was kind of like our place. Tonight, I was chilling with a mate at my house. We were both going to separate universities in a few weeks, so we were feeling quite reflective, and started talking about our childhoods, and in particular, our many trips to these abandoned buildings. Eventually, although it was late, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to hop in his car and drive the short journey to his place. When we got there, it was pitch black, and we had absolutely no gear, except for the torches on our phones. He'd even come straight from work, so he was still in his formal suit. We arrived at the place and began to walk around, looking at all the buildings and recounting stories of the summers we had spent here. We were talking carelessly and loudly. In hindsight, this was probably a mistake. We were quite deep in the complex when it started. A loud tapping sound. The sound of metal on metal. It startled us, and we both jumped. In an effort to calm ourselves down, we told each other it was probably just the wind. It didn't take us long to work out that this couldn't be the case. The tapping has a rhythm to it, but it was one that would keep on changing. A few times it would even have a recognizable tune such as Queen, "We Will Rock You." At this point, me and my mate were terrified. We started to slowly, as quietly as possible, go back the way we had come, and towards where his car was parked. We had only made it a few meters when I accidentally stepped in a bit of medium-duty foam board lying on the floor. It snapped with what felt like the loudest sound in the world. At this point, the tapping abruptly stopped, and everything went silent. We started to creep away again. We'd only made it a bit further when something I will never forget, but I wish I could, happened. We heard a voice. It sounded mad. It was loud and clear enough to hear. A man's voice. And it was speaking English. But what it was saying didn't make any sense. Just a random jumble of words and phrases, blurted out with any pause. At this point, we both broke. We sprinted towards the way out, surpassing the urge to scream like kids. As we were running to the entrance, we ran past another building. And as we ran past, quite loudly this time, we heard another voice. It was a man's voice again, but definitely different from the first one. This one saying a similar assortment of nothing, but we didn't stop to listen. We sprinted full tilt till we got to his car, hurled ourselves in and screeched off. We got back to mine and practically hugged each other for the rest of the night. It might not sound that creepy now, but something about those voices coming from the abandoned buildings put fear in the animal part of my brain. I hope you guys enjoyed reading this. I know I didn't really enjoy living it. It put a weird end to the place otherwise associated with a good childhood memory. I don't know if I'll ever want to go back. When I was in the 8th to 10th grade, I was extremely involved in a small building server. The average age was probably 15 to 17, and I joined a group of builders and Skyped with them every weekend for hours. We all became close fast and trusted each other enough that we followed each other on Instagram. I became particularly close with one of the builders in my group. His name was Peter. Peter was in the same grade as me, and we ended up texting quite a bit. I heard rumors that Peter might have had a crush on me. He denied them, which I found laughable because it was the internet, and I brushed it off. Everything was fine for a while until something began to feel off. When I talked to him, I was starting to constantly catch him telling me small lies. This bothered me, so I figured it was time to distance myself from Peter, and I stopped talking to him. Cut to a few months later and no contact with Peter, and out of the blue he texted me and said he's going to possibly transfer to my high school so that he can get into an in-state tuition for college. Peter's plan is to somehow live completely alone and support himself while in high school. My stomach drops when I read the text. and I know this feels very, very off. I try to calm and tell myself that his plan is crazy. I tell him that it's oddly convenient that he chose my random suburb. Peter insists that his plan will work, and it's just a coincidence that he's going to be going to my high school. I'm trying to call Peter's bluff, and hoping he's just screwing with me, because I cut him off. Peter says he bought the plane tickets already, and is going to stay in my town and visit some high schools in the area. Fear washes over me, and I realize that Peter definitely has some very unhealthy attachment to me. Peter was not bluffing. To my horror, he posted a picture on Snapchat at the airport. Peter asked to meet up while he's there, and I of course decline. Later, I see on his Snapchat story that he's taking a tour of my high school. Peter is taking lots of videos and pictures, probably hoping that I can see. Luckily, I'm stuck at home with pneumonia. I spend the next few days on edge and afraid that he's going to ring my doorbell at any moment. Luckily, he was not smart enough to find out where I live, and he flies home and doesn't follow his plan. The baffling part is that none of my old group on Minecraft server thought he was doing anything creepy. I felt like I was going crazy for thinking that this was weird. I thought my rejection for this meetup and continued no contact would be the end of it, but about 2 years later, and I just committed to my dream college, I still stupidly followed Peter on social media because I wanted to make sure if he was coming to my area. Once again, Peter did. I see him posing in front of the library at my college with the caption saying, "Transferring here is definitely the move." Cut to a few months later, and Peter finds out that I had a boyfriend and directly contacts me for the first time in 2 years. He starts asking strange questions like, "Will he protect you?" I shouldn't have answered, but for some reason I did. I finally blocked him and stopped following him on his social media out of fear. He has not tried to contact me since. Definitely made some mistakes because I was young and scared, and he had others telling me that it was not a big deal. So, Peter, let's not meet. To start, let me explain myself. I'm 5'7", 113 pounds, and I was 16 at the time of the encounter. I'm a multi-sport athlete: track, handball, volleyball, basketball, and hockey. And I have insomnia. This all happened around 2 a.m. on August 10th of 2019. I'd been over to my best friend's place because she had just returned home from a vacation, and she had birthday presents for me. Hoodies and gummies, if you're curious. I'd spent almost an hour there already, and wanted to head back home soon because, honestly, my town is scary at night. Drug dealers, serious offenders, and you know, the deal. So I waved goodbye to my best friend and start walking down her street. I guess a party had just let out, because behind me at the end of the road, about 20 or 30 yards from where I was standing, there were a couple of men walking across the crosswalk. They were both pretty tall, I'm guessing between 5'11" and 6'3". The two seemed harmless at first when I looked in their direction, but soon they came to a stop. They were both looking at me. At this point I felt uncomfortable, so I just kept walking. That's when I overheard one of them said, "Hey, that's a girl." At this point I whipped my head around. They were starting to walk in my direction now, and one of the two men had moved towards the sidewalk, where there was no light. I knew at this point that something wasn't right, and I began to pick up my pace. They were still getting closer, and I didn't know where the second guy was, but when I looked back, the first guy was still following me down the middle of the road. I think they were planning to cut me off and try to trap me between the two of them. The minute I was about 13 yards away from the T intersection, I started to run, and that's when the yelling started. "Oh, great, now she's running." I hooked a sharp right and then a left. I could still hear them behind me, and at this point, all I knew was that I couldn't stop moving. I had to lose them somehow. I was coming up to an apartment building with a small parking lot behind it. There were no lights. I made a split-second decision to veer off into the parking lot, and I squeezed myself under one of the cars. I don't know how long I waited there. It could have been a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. I watched the two men run past. They didn't bother to check under the cars, which was definitely in my favor. The minute I felt that I was safe, I backtracked and took a different route back to my home. I was too scared to take the main route, in the fear I would have been bumped into them. I know what I'm about to say is stupid, but I didn't go to the police. I wouldn't have been able to give a proper description of the men, because I hadn't seen their faces. If there's anything I have learned from my experience, it's that no matter who you are, you need to be extremely careful. You can think that the part of the town or city that you live in is safe, but that really isn't the case. There is no protective barrier to keep out people with bad intentions. Please, whatever you do, watch your surroundings as if your life depends on it. If I had been listening to my music or not paying attention, I hate to think what could have happened to me. I hope that no one else has to experience the fear that I did. It was almost like prey being chased by predators. And to the two men who followed me, let's never meet again. Take it back to 2007 to 2008. I was 16 when this began, 18 to 19 when it finally went to court. Picture a Norman Rockwell-esque suburban family. Parents, 3 kids, a yard and a dog, in a blink-and-you'll-miss-it USA. One random day, a neighbor man has a mild dispute with his neighbor. As a totally warranted response, neighbor man takes every hose he has and floods their yard. Solid decisions lead to solid consequences, so naturally he was fined for water waste. My parents run the water in small town USA, and because the neighbor lived in a block from us, he decided to drive over to the water district, shouting that he was an acquaintance of my parent. Second solid decision of many to come from my neighbor. Absolutely no one takes kindly to name droppers. Folks so tuck that gem away under life facts. My parents come in and tells them even if their kids did this, they would have the same repercussions, gracefully glossing over the fact that other than maybe driving by one another, none of us actually has ever interacted with a neighbor. Neighbor repeats the name of the man working the front desk, as well as my parents' name, and claims it's personal now, and storms out. My family member and I began to see the neighbor at random places, constantly the DMV, the grocery store, or our respective jobs. Apparently when you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and your parents pay for your house, you have all this kind of time to stalk. It went from random sightings while out and about to phone calls, the cliche 90s type of call, breathe, and hang up, and I can see you variety. At this point, neighbor was more of an annoyance than scary, but as I have stated, when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. Neighbor began parking across from our house, staying from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., literally just sitting in his car, blasting music, staring at the house. Fool must have had dementia, and bladder of a racehorse, because who the fuck sits in there for 10-ish hours? His music was trash too. Maybe he was a masochist, and into self-harm, seeing how long he could suffer through shitty music, and a full bladder. I doubt anyone with a semi-rational concept of social interaction could fathom why. This went on for 3 to 4 times a week, to a nightly occurrence. Imagine being a 16-year-old female that doesn't even feel comfortable to change in a room because of the prospect of him possibly seeing through the blinds somehow, trying to sleep knowing he's out there. We were prisoners in our own home. He began to get bolder. Neighbor drove his car speeding and up onto the sidewalk at my siblings and her partner while they're on the sidewalk out from coming home from a date. They both had to physically jump out of the way to avoid getting hit. He made lewd gestures at me when I brought my dog out for a walk, and was waiting for my sibling to come out and join us on the walk. It was so bad I ended up crying and going inside. This had been going on for a year at this point. The cops always said the same thing: there's nothing we can do, unless there is a threat made against you or someone is harmed. My parents confronted, meaning tired of his shit, and asking him what he thinks he's doing. Neighbor in the street after my incident, to which neighbor called the cops and they came asking us why we were harassing and threatening. I will never understand why the system waits until you are a victim, rather than prevent someone from being victimized. Almost 2 years in and it's Christmas time. My parent had a brain aneurysm. Fortunately, they made it through without any lingering effects, which is extremely rare. I convinced my other parent, who had been living at the hospital with their sick partner, to come home and shower and eat. About 9 p.m., we get a knock at the door. A random man in ratty clothing, holding a Christmas present, says he's here to deliver it to my family name. We ask him who sent him, and he says he can't say. We ask who he works for, and he shoves the gift at my parent and leaves. We are obviously uncomfortable to open it. Parent decides they need to know what it is and opens the present. Inside is a 17-page document of the grounds of why neighbor is suing my parent. That was currently in the hospital. Even I could tell it was fake, with the grammatical errors and typos. Neighbor took the time to sit and type this thing up himself, thinking it would scare us. The documented fake details he put in did not. The fact this 40-something-year-old man was so fixated on our family that he sat and typed a 17-page fake document did scare us. Things progressed, and neighbor began pacing in front of his car and pretending to have phone calls where he talked about pushing my parent down the stairs, knowing we were kids and where we went to school and worked, and how easy it would be to have access to us any time. At that time, I worked a closing shift, and it let off about 1 a.m. He would be parked next to my car and follow me home. One time, I even tried to take random roads, and he still stayed right behind me, pulling up to the house with neighbor parked across the street. Think neighborhood street with maybe 5 feet between the car parked on one side and one on the other, and having to get out and run to the door was a nightmare. We were all exhausted from not only the aneurysm scare, but also living looking over our shoulders. My parents' friend told her friend, who is a DA, about the situation. She called and came over and took our case on pro bono. Testifying was a wild ride. We had to put in official statements prior to being called to the stand. We weren't allowed to be in the room with a family member when testifying, nor were we allowed to talk in the halls as we waited for our turn. Imagine reliving 2+ years of traumatic experiences, being cross-examined when you're made out to be a liar, and then not being able to have your family comfort you for support afterwards. It wasn't very ideal. There was enough to put him away for 1.5 years, as well as grant a felony restraining order. We moved while he was still incarcerated. My sister passed while he was in prison, and he immediately tried to sue her estate. She was 21 at her death when he was released. He claimed that her testimony from him running his car at her and her partner was false, and the only reason he was locked up. Not the case, as there was harassment and stalking charges, and that the money people donated to his GoFundMe for her accident was entitled to him. There's so many more details, but this is already long enough. So neighbor, let's never, ever meet again. You made us prisoners in our home for years. Clearly you're still the same and have not learned a thing from your time of being locked up. To put this into context, I'm an 18-year-old girl living in New Zealand. I suffer from anxiety and shut down in stressful situations, and become rather overwhelmed when I'm not sure how to deal with something. The story happened yesterday. whilst I was waiting at my bus station to catch a bus home. I had a long day at work and my legs were in pain, and all I wanted to do was go home and watch some YouTube in bed. It was getting dark and the sun was almost completely down. As I was listening to some music in a rather deserted area of the bus station, a man considerably larger than myself serenaded up and sat down directly next to me on the bench, which I didn't think too much of. To put this into perspective, I'm roughly 55 kilograms. He must have been at least 100, and could have easily overpowered me. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that this man was staring at me, and began to feel a little uncomfortable, but pegged it up to him looking at my mask. It's rather nondescript, and just black. I ignored this and acted busy on my phone to avoid talking. As I said, I had a long day at work. The man began to talk and pulled out my AirPod to listen to what he was saying. The AirPod fell and landed on the ground, to which he picked it up for me, held onto it and stared at it for at least a second before handing it back to me. I was already getting bad vibes from this man. The conversation went something like this. "Your eyes are beautiful. Did you get them from your mom or dad?" My mom, I guess." I kept my reply short to try to signify I wasn't in the mood for talking, but he continued. "What bus are you catching? Where do you live?" I laughed nervously and told him I didn't feel very comfortable sharing where I lived, but I told him it was further up north. He then said, "Why? It's not like I'm going to touch you. Isn't it really fancy up there?" That's where I began to feel seriously uncomfortable and began to shake. He asked if I had a boyfriend, to which I said yes, and he proceeded to ask if I had any plans to marry him, to which I laughed and said yes. "Oh, it kind of sounds like you're just rooting him. Are you sure you want to marry him?" I was shocked and looked at him before telling him again, "Yes, I do plan to marry my partner." "How old are you?" I don't know what came over me, but I told him I was 21, to try and make it across that I was old enough to stand up for myself. "Are you on the pill?" "I'm sorry?" I didn't feel comfortable sharing that, and I don't see why you need to know that. "Oh, so you use condoms instead, eh?" I wanted to walk away, but I was grounded to the bench, and I couldn't move a muscle if I tried. I was uncomfortable and confused as to why he was asking these questions. "Do you have someone waiting for you at the bus stop, or are you walking home? How far do you live from the bus stop?" This is the question that made everything click into place, and I realized this guy had a malicious intent. He's not being friendly. This man is going to follow me home and either touch me or kidnap me. I started to really panic and started desperately looking for onlookers. A young man, possibly my age, walked out of the public bathroom, and I had overheard this conversation. He was looking at the predator rather skeptically. I knew then that I'd at least have someone to help, if I just asked for it. I didn't. By this point, I recalled a video from r/ about a highly pregnant woman and her daughter being followed in their car to an empty car park in the dark by an older man. This lady was stressfully trying to find her keys in her purse as this man was standing beside her daughter on the opposite side of the car, making small talk with them. He got impatient and walked away before she found her keys. Someone commented on her subreddit saying that this was a popular thing, that he was waiting for her to unlock the car so he would get in and control her via threats of her child. It occurred to me that I should skip my bus and catch another one at a later time. I did this exactly. He kept trying to ask where I live, and I continued refusing to tell him. He also continued to ask how far I lived from the stop, and if my partner was waiting for me. I deflected all of his questions, and after about 40 minutes, he began to get grumpy and walked away from the station. He wasn't there to catch a bus at all, but to prey on a young woman at a bus stop. I caught my bus about 10 minutes after he left, and I ran home where I completely broke down and cried in my arms of my partner. This morning I was so stressed I contemplated taking the day off of work and staying in bed for the rest of the day. I was petrified. I didn't. I'm at work posting this. After that, I've definitely decided that perhaps let's not meet again. This is truly the scariest, most horrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I've never been so petrified in my life. Till this day, I still don't know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he's still where I saw him. I'm sorry for how long the geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how secluded I was when this happened, and how badly it could have ended if it wasn't for my parents. I was back home for summer for the first time in a year, after starting uni. Our home was, still is, just outside of a small town with forest all around it. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverged from the river that ran for miles through the forest, and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home there is a small greasy path that led to the river flowing a stream. It was a long walk, but one I was used to going so often as a child. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would always go on led me off a path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I continued to walk north and follow the stream through the forest, and I get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone, or with my dad over the span of 18 years. Never saw anybody in that forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone-ish. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the path, away from the stream to the sharp bend, and then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. I was running my hands in the water, and I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring, fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well, wondering if it was a lost herding dog, and I started moving towards the sound. Yeah, I bloody know that I'd be the first person to die, but I was heading north away, so what the hell. I realized it couldn't have been a small animal. I could tell by the bell that was too heavy, because of how clear the sound was, to be on a collar. I kept moving and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell. That could have been enclosed in a tin or something. And the river was too far still. I thought about everything, but nothing explained the sound apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with the reason. I knew it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally, until I found a badger. A bloody dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife, and it was freshly done. The blood was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that it happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream. So had I. The badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated, while I was walking that way, I suppose. Don't know really. Nothing else happened that day. 1 week later I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. I left home around 6 p.m. and I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour. Then I decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late, and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could, and the sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while, through the clearest and most open part of the forest, when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger, with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree, like an almost literal load of bollocks. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently, because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain, and my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me, when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river. So someone had strung up the body after I passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it. So someone was watching me, and running around the forest, where the faint sounds of branches breaking around me, not animals. I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking around the stream back towards the path for a while, when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path, where it sharply turned west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just shit out my intestines and my stomach. I literally felt like the hairs on my neck raised despite being soaked. It was dark and I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining and every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for a long way, longer than the last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear combined with my compromised hearing, and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing at my lungs, crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing the sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had just gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half running, half speed walk thing again because I was out of breath. Then I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to look, but I went ahead and looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction, and at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was just staring straight at me. Now, I don't know if I had a hidden secret sprinting ability, or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I fucking didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied. I'm on the phone with the police. They're on the path. Dad, I can see you. I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back, and I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers in my neck, and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was on my way home. Things no longer felt real, and it was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way, and that he could see me. Because of the intonation of his voice, I pretty much lugged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too, and my mom could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car ready to leave fast. We went directly to the police station. I got medical attention soon after. My dad burst into tears in the car, said he could hear the bell, and thought he wouldn't be able to see me. Asked what if I didn't have my phone, and what if he hadn't picked up. They were almost as terrified as me because they witnessed everything through the call. They could hear me trying to run, and they could hear the danger. They just couldn't see it. The police couldn't really do much. They searched the area, and only thing they found was a folded t-shirt placed under a rock. I didn't really question that at the time, and my bag was not recovered. They said it was probably some homeless man living in the forest, but failed to realize what could have happened if my dad didn't know that part of the forest like I did, and where to find me. I'm not blaming anyone. The entire thing was my fault. There are just too many what ifs. I want to believe that it was someone who decided to live in the woods and hunt or something. Maybe they were a bit mentally unstable, and they felt angry that it came into their territory. But what if it was more insidious? The way he moved through was, to me, abnormal. It was preserved because how slowly he was ringing the bell. It's like he wanted me trapped. I didn't see any more details, and I just ran. To this day, I can't bloody go anywhere where I'm alone, and the sound of bells is a real problem, and the smell of moss as well. Anyways, my parents and Steve Jobs saved my life, so go hug yours now, and take decapitated badgers and bells as pagan signs that you're unwelcome. About 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. The walls were very thin, and because of the fire safety laws in my city, my bedroom had one window, which led into the living room, and none with outside access. The window will be important later. It was a 3-bedroom, one for me, one for my master tenant, and one spare, which at the time was rented out by a pretty friendly guy. Well, friendly guy had issues with his work visa and had to move back to Canada last minute, leaving us about 2 weeks to find another roommate. Our quickest and easiest option was Craigslist. Due to my work schedule, I had no part in the selection process, but was content when the new roommate moved in a little later. He seemed a bit off, but friendly. He was very tall, large guy, but pretty quiet, and not someone I wanted to go out of my way to hang out with, but he was okay to be around and be cordial with. About 2 weeks into his move-in, the master tenant left for Hawaii, leaving him and I alone in the house for the month-long duration of his stay. For the first few days, things were normal. All of a sudden, about 4 days into the trip, I'm woken up at about 8 a.m. to a frantic knocking at my door. Roommate, we'll call him Kyle, is standing there when I open up, looking frazzled. He looks me dead in the eye and says, "So, do you want to tell me what happened last night?" To which I was shocked and confused, because I had come home from work at about 9 p.m. and immediately showered and went to bed. I explained this to him, and he tells me that he heard me screaming and arguing with someone in my room, and that he saw me on the side alley out of my window, arguing with our landlord, who I've never even seen at this point. That he heard people coming in and out of the house. I tell him no way. None of that ever happened. After staring at me for a little longer, he leaves and doesn't bring it up again. The next morning, I wake up to the same thing. This time he says he saw me arguing with my boyfriend. I was single at the time. He had seen me talking with our other roommate, who was in Hawaii, and asking me for my badge number of the officer I spoke to, since he had apparently seen me talking to a bunch of police as well. This time I get angry and more or less tell him to cut the shit out, because I'm not doing anything and don't know what he's going on about. He gets a weird look on his face and says, I think I had a seizure in my sleep. The next time it happens, call an ambulance, and leaves for a bit, only to start knocking again about an hour later. When I open up, Kyle repeats the same exact story verbatim. This happened once more before I tell him to leave me the fuck alone and leave for work. I go to work as normal, and I'm reluctant to return that night because I'm too tired to switch to the alternate location. Big mistake. About 1 a.m. I wake up to slamming doors. Kyle's pacing back and forth between his bedroom and the living room, and out the front door, walking in and out of each room, turning the lights on and off, mumbling angrily and slamming the doors. I can see his figure pacing back and forth through the frosted windows. In the room that leads to the living room, since my room is so dark, he cannot see inside. Suddenly he screams, "I can't live like this! Why are you doing this to me?" I think he's on the phone and I don't respond. A few moments later, he screams my name repeatedly, and I realize he's directing it towards me. I knew I had to get the fuck out of there, so I very quietly crept out of my bed and started getting dressed and packing a bag of clothes for work in the morning. I'm almost done when he screams, "I hear you!" and charges over to my room, slapping the wall next to the door but not touching the door itself. I look towards my window and I see the shadow lean in forward, pressing his ear against the glass. I was freaking terrified and sat completely still, unmoving. He eventually screams my name again and moves away from the window, and I hear him start pacing between rooms again. Now, my shoes are kept on the rack outside of my door, and not inside of my room, so I know that when I leave, I'm going to have to need a moment to put them on. I decide to wait until he paces, taking him out the front door again, at which point I plan to grab my shoes, put them on, and run. As formulating this plan, the pacing stops. He screams, "Do you want to fucking fight about this? Come out right now, and we'll fight, I swear to God." I'm very small, 5-foot girl, and this guy is easily 3 times my size, so I'm definitely not looking to fight things. After a few minutes, he turns off all the lights. I hear the door to his room open and close, followed by silence. I wait for a moment to be sure I can't hear any more movement, and then decided to take my chance. I took a breath and pulled my door open quickly. I step out and grab my shoes before I look up a second later, and I see him standing shirtless, with just a pair of boxers and socks on, in the dark of the hallway. His arms hung slightly outward in an awkward position. He says in a low and calm voice, "Ma'am, we need to talk." This was a hard no for me, so I grabbed my shoes and ran out the door, with them in hand. I run about a half block barefoot before I stop to put them on. When I look back, he is standing in the porch light of the front door, watching me run, but not moving. Luckily, I had a friend who lived 2 blocks away, and I had their spare key. So I let myself in and crashed there for the night. And that's where I stayed for the next week or so while I worked things out with the master tenant, and Kyle agreed to move out within the week. He says he doesn't remember anything that happened, or wasn't sure if it was real or not. But if I said that's what went down, then it must have been real. The day Kyle left, he sent me a photo of the house key sitting on the table, and says, "I'm out." Nothing else. I take a friend over there with me to scout it out, and ensure that he has actually left. When we get there, we discover that not only has he left a ton of food and furniture, but he also ripped out all the fire alarms out of the ceilings. He had unscrewed and removed the deadbolts from the front doors, and left them lining up neatly on the front table. We then realized that my front door can only lock by using a key from the outside, and it had been locked when we arrived, meaning Kyle still had a key. We called the locksmith immediately. Even after changing the locks, I was still terrified to stay there alone afterwards, and never went to sleep at night without barricading the door with chairs and other furniture. To this day, I still fear for the safety. He was obviously psychologically unstable, but also wondered what could have happened if I hadn't been so lucky as well. I live in France, and this story happened to me this summer, just after the lockdown ended. I was, and still am, 19 at the time. After the lockdown ended, I went to my grandparents to spend a few weeks. I got tested before, and no problems there. My grandparents live in a small city in the north of France, and they have a dog who's quite a bit big. When I was really young, I lived at my grandparents for a year, and at that time the dog was only a puppy. Her name was Chippy, in French, which means little devil in English, but in an affectionate way. Considering when I was living there, I played with her a lot. We were both really close, and that will have an importance later. Two of my hobbies are having long walks and running. Thus, every evening I go out for a long walk with the dog. There's a track that follows a path through the forest, then there's a small hill, and on the top there's a big place with lots of fields there. I've run there a lot, so I know the place. The air is fresh, and it's quite a beautiful view. So I was going there with the dog every day. It was also helping my grandparents to have their dog have lots of exercise. The first time we went, there was nothing special happening. We just enjoyed our walk. It's about 6 to 7 kilometers, so basically an hour walk. The next day when we arrived at the top of the hill in the field, it was probably around 10 p.m., but there was still some light because it's summer. There was 3 persons walking the field. They were younger than me, probably around 15 to 16. I also noticed that they were smoking, so my guess was that they used to come up here, so they couldn't be seen by their parents. We went past them, I greeted them, and they greeted back. Once again, nothing special there. For a whole week, I did this walk around the same time, 10 p.m.-ish, and passed by the 3 guys with nothing special happening. And it was perfectly fine with me this way. The second week, as usually, I went on a walk with the big dog Chippy, and arrived at the field. There was only one of the 3 boys, and he wasn't smoking this time though. When he saw me, I was at the entrance to the field, just after a little hill climb, so the entrance of the forest was just behind me. He did a sign with his hand to catch my attention, and asked if I had a lighter, which I actually had in my pocket. I told him, yeah, sure, so he walked to me, the hand in the pocket of his hoodie. When he came near, for some reason, I felt a shiver. It's crazy how sometimes your instincts know there's a problem, but you don't listen to it because nothing looks weird to you. I hand over the lighter when he passed by. At that moment, my dog was staring at him. Then everything happened really fast. He did a really fast movement with his hand coming from the hoodie, and I only saw something shining. I just had a reflex of throwing myself back, so hard that I fell down. And I just realized that he had a knife he was holding, and he tried to stab me. What saved me is my dog, God bless her. When she saw the guy trying to stab me, she jumped on him, and he fell down. As I said before, it's a really, really big dog. I immediately got up on my feet and heard something in my back. From the entrance to the forest, I saw the 2 guys wearing animal masks running to me. They were probably the 2 friends. In the moment, your brain acts for yourself. You don't think at all. In this case, the answer he found was really simple. The other guy was still on the ground, and I was just watching the dog, and told her, run. I started running and she followed me, but I heard the worst possible thing from the guy who got up as well. Catch him! Don't let him go! At this moment, I was totally terrified. I was just running, and I was hearing them run behind me. I was only thinking, how long will they follow me? Who the hell are they? This was the first time I was really happy to be a runner. I was clearly better than those guys, and that totally saved me. because they chased me for something that felt like an eternity. Fortunately, at the end of the field, there's another entrance to the forest, and this time, it's a descent with the road at the end. I heard the steps of the three guys vanishing as I arrived at the end of the forest, though I didn't stop running until I arrived at my grandparents' house and locked myself. I caught a big breath and gave a huge hug to the dog. I saw in her eyes that she totally understood what had happened, and I'd never been so happy to have her in my life. After that, I told everything to my grandparents. We called the police and they didn't find anyone. I don't know what those guys wanted, but the animal mask really made me think about some kind of Satanist. I really don't want to know anyway. I still do take long walks with Chippy the hero dog, but I now go earlier and to places with a little more people. I hope you enjoyed my story, and I apologize again if I made any mistakes. And to the three guys in the forest, let's not ever meet again. About 5 years ago, I was volunteering in a listening service that was only aimed at helping children up to 18 years of age. A lot of training was required for this role, even though it was an anonymous phone service. If a child presented with a dangerous situation, and we had their permission, then we would call the appropriate authorities, i.e. the police or social services. After a few weeks, I was feeling settled in, and I had taken many calls. The majority were just kids joking around, but there were many tough calls too. Most evenings after I'd finished my shift, I would feel so overcome with emotion that I would fight back tears on the way home in my car. Having a small child of my own often made it harder to forget about. One phone call in particular really startled me, and till this day I often think about it. It was about 9:45 p.m., 15 minutes before my shift ended, and I was sitting around. I hadn't taken a call for over an hour, and time seemed to be moving slowly. My phone rings, and a petite, soft female voice says, "Hello." I introduced myself giving a fake name, as I always do, and tell her a little bit about the service, and about what we do and what we would do if someone's in danger. She says almost immediately, "I need help. I'm babysitting my younger sister. She's only about 2 months old, and I'm 9. She's diabetic and she's turning blue. My mother and father are gone out. Please help." I felt as though all my training had gone out the window. I was panicking but tried my best to keep my thoughts clear and my voice clear. "Go outside and get help. Go and knock on a neighbor's house, and call the nearest adult you see," I insisted. The little girl talked to me through her steps and said she had the baby in her arms and was out in the street. Listening to the noise of the traffic and sounds of the night air, my heart was beating fast, aching to know what was going to happen and feeling so helpless. I could hear the little girl speaking to someone, but I couldn't make out what was being said. Next of all, a lady came to the phone. "I have them. Hello? Hello? I have them both. I'm going to take them to the nearest hospital." I thanked the lady, and she told me that the help was on the way. I ended the call, and once I gathered myself, I informed my supervisor. She was as shocked as I was when I gave her all the details. She called the hospital in the area that the girl had given me, and she also called the police. After an hour of filling out the mandatory documents, my supervisor followed up the inquiry about the call we'd received, and they said that they had no such cases, finding it quite strange. We finished off writing the notes and shut down for the night. The next shift wasn't until the following week, which I was grateful for. I needed the time off. When I returned after my week off, my supervisor called me into her office and informed me she had gone through my notes in the call I received and had gone search the system for similar scenarios and keywords. She told me that every caller had a profile, and that the girl who called was a frequent caller, and that she wasn't a little girl, but a lady in her early 30s in a psychiatric hospital. and she liked to pose as different people, but mostly as children. This creeped me out considering the nature of the service, and the fact that an adult was abusing the service. This information angered me and also disturbed me. I feel silly and naive as I believe this girl's story. Over the next few months, she called a few more times under different descriptions, and always posing as a vulnerable person. I wasn't there for much longer, but that story always gives me creeps when I think about it. Long-time lurker, figured I'd share my story. I was living in Tbilisi a few years ago, the capital republic of Georgia, running a kind of legally ambiguous customer credit operation. When I figured it was time, I took a much-needed weekend getaway in a nearby small town. The town I settled on is an extremely popular tourist location, given its beautiful location among the river, nestled in a deep valley and rifled with ancient churches, with many options for potential guest houses, hotels, and rentals. I decided not to book in advance, and to just trapeze around until I found something appropriate. I found a very adequate guest house, perched on a hill with about a 1-acre plot. Upon entering the guest house, I was greeted in a typical Georgian fashion by an incredibly hospitable woman in her 60s to 90s. Hyperbole, but former Soviet Union is like that age-wise, and her son, who was in his early 30s, who resumed his yard work of filling a large hole he said was a septic tank with a foul lingering smell. After a brief introduction, again in typical Georgian fashion, the hostess offered me tea, homemade wine, bread, and cheese, all of which were much needed and fantastic. I'm an American, but my family came from Eastern Europe, so I speak Russian, as most Georgians do, so we were able to chat a lot. Our conversations progressed from basic get to know you, bits of more personal information, like whether I'm seeing anyone or who I'm dating, which does come up in a surprisingly frequency when you meet sweet grandmothers who want to meet their granddaughters. At the time, I was dating a fellow expat from a Western European country. When I told the hostess that I was seeing someone, she seemed thrilled and asked me to show her a photo. She reacted with, "Aha," and nodded in approval, commenting on her physique in a way that would probably be inappropriate, but it was cute for an old grandma. I was then pressed by the hostess as to why I didn't invite her, and how this isn't what a good boyfriend would do. Put on the spot like this, I lied, and said she was very busy with a work project, and she wasn't, but would be arriving at a later time in the evening. She didn't ask. The hostess was elated by the news and called over her son, and asked me to show the photo of the girl I was seeing. Early in our conversation, it was established that I did not speak in Georgian. The son saw the photo and affirmatively nodded and spoke in Georgian to the hostess, briefly, and then turned to me, with a beaming smile and thumbs up, and said in English, "Very pretty. You lucky brother." He then in Russian asked if I texted her to invite her. I lied and said I did text her, and reiterated that she was arriving in a few hours. It was around 4 p.m. at the time, in a beautiful golden hour glow that lit up the surrounding mountains and valley. The son said he would join us and asked if I had liked cha-cha. Cha-cha is a very strong national liquor of Georgia, ranging from 30 to 75% alcohol content, and made from distilled grapes. I had become quite the savant of cha-cha, and despite some strange feeling about their fixation on the female visitor, I obliged. Cha-cha is not for the weak-hearted, but I was very used to consuming it at the time. I should have paid more attention to the very intentional placement of the shots he filled for us, but I pushed those misgivings aside and had the shot after a very traditional toast. Around 20 minutes later, I felt exhausted and ill, and excused myself from the room, saying I needed to take a quick nap. Walking to my room, I knew something was amiss. As mentioned in the beginning, I was fronting a questionable business, and I did have a firearm in my bag, and made a mental note to take it and put it under my pillow. But as one can imagine, it isn't easy to remember things, even on short term when apparently drugged. Despite failing to collect my weapon, I did close my blinds as the afternoon sun was blaring in the room, and I wanted darkness. Passing out around 4:30 p.m., I woke to darkness at 4:45 a.m. with a raging headache. My window shades were practically open despite me closing them before passing out. They were open with about 2 feet of space visible to the outside. My bags were not in the position I left them, and the television was on, and on high volume despite me never using it, and the door was partially closed. I peered out the window and didn't see anything, so I quickly went to my bag, retrieved my firearm, and went to the bathroom, with the intention of calling my coworker or a driver to pick me up. I had no cell service, and no Wi-Fi, despite having perfectly fine reception the day prior. I went back to the bed, with the weapon under the pillow, with zero desire to inclination to fall back asleep. After about an hour or so of pretending to be asleep, I saw the sun peer through the window to get a look inside. At this point, I was certain it wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me, and that I was in trouble. I came out around sunrise to find both the hostess and her son sipping tea on the deck, and told the hostess that my girlfriend was arriving soon on a bus, and that I'd bring her when it arrived. I grabbed my backpack and left my other bag to give the impression I wasn't fleeing. Got service immediately after leaving the property, and called a partner to pick me up. Old school businessman, who was floating the money I'd run the leading operation with. I told him the story and he said that he would handle it. And he did handle it. I still think about the foul-smelling hole the sun was digging. Last guest? Weeks later, I decided that wasn't the place or business for me, and applied to law school on the other side of the world. As my uncle started to get worried about the situation, we heard it. People in the woods. We didn't see how many because of the darkness. They were saying something. We all gather here by the blood of incoherence, and we incoherent again. Thee and thy, and more incoherence. As my uncle and I heard that, he yelled for his dogs to follow him out of the woods. As we all left, he turned his head back and only saw a slight movement of branches and shrubs, perhaps because the people were trying to hide. After that happened, he hasn't walked his dog in those woods, nor when it gets dark neither. So to the strangers in the woods, let's not meet. The next story that I'm about to read might be extremely disturbing to some, so trigger warnings and viewers' discretion advised. I've always wanted to share this story, and I've decided to use an old throwaway account since I usually just lurk. I have no real way of providing my credibility, but if you've ever visited or lived in a rural part of South Asia, you can probably vouch for me in saying that it's a lot more plausible than one might assume. Also, this ended up being a lot longer than I thought, but I wanted to recount it precisely the way I remembered it. I had one of those moments recently where a lot of things came together in my brain to make sense of an event that my child mind couldn't properly comprehend at the time. So, my mom was born and raised in the UK, but she is of South Asian descent, and since I'm mixed, she tried really hard to make sure I'm in touch with my culture. This meant that, as a child, we made a lot of frequent visits back home. It's like every summer I can remember was spent there, and then it suddenly just stopped after this incident. My mom's family back home live in an extremely rural part of the country. There is a lot of poverty surrounding our family home, so we rarely left our
relatively nice part of the village. I was never allowed to explore, and coming from the concrete jungle that is London, I was always so curious. I'm going to explain what happened on this particular day the way I remembered experiencing it, and then I'll explain what I failed to realize at the time. I was 8 at the time, and one of my uncles from a neighboring village would often visit with his children, and when they did, my mom would let me go with them to the small hut-like shop that sold sweets and snacks like 15 minutes away from the family home. My cousins were 11 and 19 and both male, and it was broad daylight. To get to the shop, we walked through a small DIY road, and on both sides is what I would call the jungle. It was basically just a lot of trees and bushes as far as the eye can see. You can't really see anything beyond the trees. It's just a lot of greenery. I'm mixed with East Asian, and I definitely get my looks from my dad's side, so being an obvious foreigner in a rural part of back home meant that I was pretty used to strangers staring and asking me questions. I was also used to creepy men that would tell me I was beautiful because I have pale skin. My mom warned me about these men and made sure I knew to stay away from them, so the road to the hut was paved with creepy people, making creepy comments, and my cousins basically telling them to leave me alone. In less pleasant terms. There was also a group of young guys. Some of them had motorbikes and some were just chilling. One of them waved at me. He seemed friendly enough, and I had met so many people that my mom was convinced I must remember from last time that I had zero recollection of. So I just waved back and went about my day. Once we got to the hut, we immediately started losing our self-control with the snacks. The owner was super friendly, and he let us try a bunch of the sweets he had. He also had kulfi ice cream for the first time. I distinctly remember being really excited because my mom and one of the ladies that worked as a cook both loved kulfi ice cream, so I thought it would be a nice surprise for them. I asked for 3 and the nice guy gave me 4, and so my hands were full and they were quickly melting, and he told me to run, go home quickly. I told my cousins I would start running, and once they finished, they would catch up with me. I would still be in their line of sight, plus it was daylight, and it was a busy road. I start running back, and there were a few older aunties stood at the top of the road, and something about their presence gave me a sense of security. I felt a lot safer knowing they were there, and paired with the fact that my cousins were able to see me clearly, I felt comfortable enough to just walk back leisurely, minding my business, eating my ice cream. I passed a group of guys, and the one that waved to me came over to me. He said I was X's niece, right? X being my uncle. And he jokingly took one of my ice creams and said, she got me an ice cream for Mama. Mama means uncle in our language. And so I just assumed he was a friend of my uncle's. He asked me when I arrived and how I was finding the country. He was so friendly, and he didn't look like the stereotypical creep. When I said I was going to go home, he said, "Why don't you let your uncle take you? You can ride on my motorbike." I think that's when something clicked in my mind, that maybe he wasn't the friendly uncle I thought he was. That's also when I realized I was pretty much circled in and was surrounded by the group. It's also when I realized I couldn't see my cousins, or the group of old ladies, which also meant they probably couldn't see me. I wish I could explain in words how helpless and afraid I was. I had all the threats in the world explained to me by my mom, in a country where I knew I was vulnerable and had to be cautious, and I still managed to find myself in a dangerous situation. Luckily, my cousins came running and shouting, probably because I was their responsibility, and the guys ran off into the jungle. This creeped me out because there was nothing in the jungle. It was just trees as far as the eye can see, and I knew that it would be nearly impossible to find them in all of that. We caused quite the scene, and the villagers seemed to react as if they were already on edge. When we told my family what had happened, I was basically on a house arrest, and my mom refused to let me out of her sight. I was pretty shook up about the whole situation, and so, honestly, I was kind of grateful for that. I put it down to my paranoia,
but at the time I would get overwhelmed feelings of being watched. Our village is quite small. Like amongst them is everyone who knows everyone sort of thing. My uncle is also a big community figure, and he's very well known amongst the villagers, which is why the men probably put two and two together, that I was his niece. Having foreign family over is usually a pretty big deal, and having a niece that is mixed race was also a very big deal. I'm sure word got around. He realized that there were a group of men on motorbikes who would frequently go past our house. They stayed a decent distance from our home though, and that they weren't anyone that we would have known. It's creepy to think about now, the lengths they were going to. A couple of days before we were due to fly back home, I had my second, last and worst encounter with a particular friendly uncle. It was night, and it was like every other night. We would play board games and card games in the front room, because it was so hot. I went to my bedroom and I was playing on my Nintendo DS. When I saw, out of the corner of my eye, someone at the window, staring directly at me. It was him. The worst part is he had the most creepy, sick and twisted smile I'd ever seen. He put up a finger to his lips, but I did the literal opposite and started screaming hysterically. I had been on edge since the ice cream incident, so what might seem like an overreaction was just my natural response. I can't really tell you what happened next because no one has ever told me. My very large uncle and his also very large friends are not known to be the friendliest of people, but I was told he was dealt with, and that he would never bother me again. We recently received a wedding film from one of our cousins' weddings, and part of the film was her leaving to get to the venue, and I noticed that jungle was no longer there. It had basically been cut down. For the first time I could see beyond the greenery. That's when my mom explained to me that my uncle had it cut down not long after that particular visit, because of the head cutters. It sounds even more sinister in my language. My entire life I wondered what would happen to me if I had gone on the motorbike, but now I know with reasonable certainty what his intentions were. During that time, a gang had been kidnapping beggar children. It took a while for the village to realize because it's not unusual for beggar children to go missing. When we were there, people were vaguely aware, and it was becoming a trend. A couple of months later, a head was found. It became known in our village, but people tried to keep quiet to avoid getting a bad name. The problem went away once a lot of the greenery was cut down, so there was nowhere left to hide. It's also when they realized the magnitude of what had happened. The weird thing is, I've known about the head cutters for a while. I knew it was something that had occurred in our village, but for some reason, until recently, I never put two and two together. But now that I have, I think often about what nearly happened to me, but more importantly, what happened to a handful of children in our little village. I think about the fact that beyond our relatively small circle, no one thinks about them. No one is haunted by their deaths. So to the creepy uncle with the motorbike, let's not meet again. I wish the children had never met you, and I hope no one ever has the misfortune of meeting you ever again. The story I'm about to tell you happened yesterday night. I live in Nantes, West France. I'm quite a petite girl, and I avoid confrontation whenever I can. I'm pretty good at it because, since I can remember, I had a very strong sixth sense thing. I try to avoid people who make me anxious. It allows me to survive some very dangerous situations and prevent one kidnapping. But that's not part of the story. Yesterday I visited a very close friend of mine a few days ago. She broke her leg, so I decided to cheer up by giving her a few gifts. The atmosphere was so nice that I didn't notice when it got dark outside. Despite the late hour, I decided to go home. I said goodbye to my friend and left her apartment. I was about 40 minutes from home, but I walked the distance many times without any problems, so I thought it would be the same this time. Oh, how I was wrong. Less than 5 minutes passed, and I just felt it was going to hell. I was approaching one of the many bridges in our city. I didn't see anyone around, and I thought my senses were playing tricks on me. This happened before, so I kept on going. The bridge was about 20 meters in front of me before I heard a conversation and a giggle. I turned my head slightly and saw 3 men walking towards me. I felt a cold sweat on my back, but it was too late to turn back. I didn't want to show them that I was afraid. I know this type of behavior provokes more harassment. I kept walking and turned the music down. I didn't take my headphones off because I didn't want them to know about my suspicions. I heard their footsteps behind me. They were saying something, but I didn't know what because they were speaking in a different language. I was also already on the bridge when they caught up with me. As I said, I'm a petite girl. They were over 180 centimeters tall, and they surrounded me. I had no choice but to go ahead. A shudder ran through my body, and I didn't know what they wanted or what they were saying, but I felt that I was in danger. They kept talking to me, and they leaned over and whispered something into my ears, and they laughed. The sound will haunt me for the rest of my life, and at one point they noticed. I was doing my best to ignore them, and then the worst began. They started making animal noises. It may sound strange and maybe even funny, but it was terrifying to me. They howled and growled and whistled and kissed the air softly. They did these things very close to my face. I was desperate, but where would I go? I was on the bridge. I would kill myself if I jumped into the water, or at least break both my legs if I were lucky. Those 2 minutes to cross the bridge felt like an eternity to me. When we got to the end of the bridge, I was sweating and close to tears. I thought I was going to throw up. I was shaking, which seemed to amuse them even more. And then a miracle happened. Someone called my name very loudly. I looked up and saw someone approaching us. He was a very tall man, several years older than me, but I didn't know him. I had no idea who he was and how he knew my name, but it didn't matter to me at the time. I felt he was my guardian angel, and he came over to us, and he was staring furiously at the 3 strangers. I didn't see their faces, but they fell silent. "What are you doing to my girlfriend?" he asked, still frowning at them. He stretched out his hand in my direction, never taking his eyes off of them. "Come on, sweetheart." I did not wait. I didn't know who he was, why he was helping me, but I didn't care. I gripped his hand tightly and almost nestled against his shoulder. My heart was beating fast and loud, but I was so thankful that he came to me. 3 strangers and my savior exchanged glances, and they were silent. I was actually starting to panic and thought that they might have attacked him because he was there alone, and I wouldn't have the strength to help him if they would attack. But it didn't happen. I almost heard their teeth grinding when he muttered something. My savior held my hand tightly and watched them. They turned back and went back on the bridge, and we stood at the same place for some time. He looked at me and smiled, and at that moment my body gave up. I started shaking uncontrollably and almost drowned in my own tears. He didn't say a word. He just held my hand and gave me time to cool down. After a long moment, he offered to take me home. We walked slowly and talked about various things, actually. He was talking all the time, and I was just nodding. I found out that he was walking near the bridge and noticed the whole scene. He decided to react and help me, if I turned out that his assumptions were correct. I asked him how he knew me and how he knew my name. He looked surprised and then smiled. He said, "I didn't know your name." He used a name because it was one of the most popular in our country. When we got home, I was still shaky but happy. I offered him something to drink, and I don't live alone, so I really wasn't worried about letting him in. But he kindly declined, and we waved goodbye. I can't believe how lucky I was yesterday. If I hadn't met him, I don't know if I could write about it today. So, Luke, thank you. Thank you so much for saving me. I hope to meet you one day. As to these 3 strangers, I hope one day you'll understand that your behavior is reprehensible, and you will change your attitude to women who walk alone. And I hope to never meet you again. Sorry, this is a long one. This happened a few years ago, but I still think about it till this day. I was on holiday in a city on the other side of the country, celebrating my 21st birthday with my best friend. We were having an amazing night out with a few too many drinks, and ended up meeting two guys. Let's call them Andrew and Billy. They seemed like really cool guys, and we were really well getting to know them, and asked us to go back with them to their hotel room, and we said yes. Obviously a silly idea, but we were young and drunk. Things were great on the way back to the hotel room. We were all laughing and having a great time. When we got to the hotel room, there were two other men there as well. Let's call them Ricky and JD, who were at least 10 to 15 years older than us. They gave us creepy vibes, but we brushed it off. We asked Andrew and Billy who these guys were, and they said they were colleagues as they were in the city for work, and their company paid for their rooms. So Andrew and Billy were in different rooms, but we were all partying in Andrew's room that he shared with Ricky. I got a little too drunk and my friend put me to bed. She said that she was going to Billy's room and asked if it'd be okay with Andrew if I said yes. Keep in mind, my friend didn't have a phone either, so we basically had no way of getting in contact with each other. Another stupid thing, I know. So I've been in bed for a while with Andrew, just talking and chilling when he says, I just gotta have to pop out real quick, I'll be right back. I assumed he meant just to go to the bathroom and not out of the actual hotel room. But he left the hotel room to get something from Billy's room. Anyways, I was just watching TV in the bed when the bedroom door opens, and I assumed it was Andrew, but my heart sank when it was Ricky, the weird colleague. He walked into the room and sat on the bed. Keep in mind, I'm very naked at this point, trying to cover myself with a blanket. He said, "Do you realize that everyone has left you alone in here, right? It's just you, all alone. No one's here. No one can hear you." And continued edging closer and closer to me on the bed. At this point, I was completely speechless and absolutely terrified. I was completely frozen in fear and had no idea what to do. I tried to say something, but nothing came out. He definitely sensed my fear, and for some reason, he just got up and left. A sense of relief flooded me, and I felt silly for overacting. That was until I heard JD, other random colleague, shouting, "Get the F back in there! What are you doing? This isn't what we discussed. Get the fuck in there and do what you're meant to do. Who gives a fuck about that whore? Just get back in there now and do what you need to do." I ran to the bathroom and locked myself in because I was so scared, but there was no way out, and the only way out of the hotel room was through the front door, and I had to walk past Ricky and JD to get there. I was so terrified, I had millions of thoughts rushing through my head, and I had no idea what to do, but I knew I had to escape. I decided my only option was to leave the room and be ready to defend myself if things were to go pear-shaped. I threw my clothes on and grabbed my shoes, and I opened the door, and Ricky and JD were sitting on the couch close to the bedroom door. JD said, "Hey sexy, where are you going in such a rush? Come and join us, come here right now." I said, "No thanks," and I ran to the front door and ripped it open. When I got out, I was so relieved, but I was still in a random hotel in a random city, with no way to contact my friend. But I thought my best option was to get to the lobby and just wait. As I was walking, I heard two men yelling from down the hall. "Where are you? We know you aren't going too far away from us. Come back and join us. You know you want to." It was Ricky and JD. I was absolutely fucking terrified by this point. I began sprinting to the elevator. I could hear them gaining on me. I never knew I could run so fast, but I just continued and I didn't look back. I felt like I was running forever until I reached the end of the corridor, and my worst nightmare had come true. I missed the turn-off of the elevator, so I had to turn and run back towards where I could hear Ricky and JD still yelling down the hallway. I found the elevator and I got in. I could hear the voices getting louder and louder, and I didn't want to imagine what would have happened if they got into the elevator with me. The door finally closed after what felt like a lifetime. I thought I would go down to the lobby and just wait there because at least there would be people, so there would be some form of safety. I got to the lobby and realized that there was no one in sight. No one at all, even behind the desk. I sat on a couch and I don't know what to do with myself, and I was just absolutely terrified that Ricky and JD would come to the lobby. Then I heard the elevator ding and the door open. My heart dropped. But it was Andrew. I told him what had happened and he was outraged that his colleagues did that, and he took me to where my best friend was. Everything turned out fine, but it could have been a lot worse. So, Ricky and JD, let's never meet again. I grew up in Texas. I still live here along with my family that will be mentioned in this story. When the 2007 recession hit, my father lost his job. It was a management job that paid well. We lived in a comfortable but slightly country area outside of Lockhart, Texas. With our income at a halt, we lost our home and had to move. My parents found a trailer park with a 2-bedroom for rent. A little cramped for our family of 5, but we had no other choice. The man we rented from was crooked, but for other reasons. But he's not the disturbed landlord the story revolves around. We lived in that trailer for a few years before needing to move out for other reasons. I was too young to remember. I was 11 years old when my parents began house hunting again. Down the road from the trailer park was a cul-de-sac of land. There was a business in the center of the land called the Why Not Party House. That was a bar and a wannabe club, I suppose. Considering I was a child, I never entered that building. There were a few houses and trailers scattered around different parts in this secluded circle. A worn-looking trailer was for rent, and the man renting it, Mr. Dahl, was an elderly man who couldn't have been younger than 65 or so. A few things to note about this trailer: it had some old stone steps leading up to the front door. There was a bunk bed in one of the rooms and a somewhat functioning air hockey table. The master bedroom had a queen-size bed, and there was a carpet in the kitchen, which I always found strange. The back door was nailed shut and completely unusable, if that wasn't enough to make you say nope. Then let me also say it had a mice problem. My family is a working class, my mother is disabled, and with my father out of work, we only relied on her disability check. We had no other choice to rent out this trailer or be homeless. The entire deal was strange and honestly sad. This was the position we were in. But my parents rented out this trailer on the agreement of words only. There was no official lease that was signed, or any sort of legal documents that prove we were renting from this man. Before we moved into the trailer, Mr. Dahl took it upon himself to build a new deck for us to replace the old steps. He even built a little picnic table for us to sit around. And as a child, it completely blew my mind the stranger could be so kind to craft these things without being asked or wanting money. It seemed like an act of pure kindness. A bad person wouldn't do that sort of thing, right? The first few weeks of renting from him went by without a hitch. The master bedroom had no light bulbs, and we weren't there long enough to change them. So my family and I all slept in the living room. Something about that bedroom with a bunk bed seemed scary to me. I'm unsure how my brothers felt, but they never slept in there either. As I mentioned previously, we relied on my mother's disability. Sometimes we were late on rent and had to pay late fees. Other than that, Mr. Dahl would be very understanding about everything, despite being a little irritated. My mother's check hit every first of the month, which is also the month for bills. Her, my father, and my older brother got into the car and drove into the city to take care of bills, and to get a money order for rent. I was left with my oldest brother. It was a time when we had no internet or cable, just VHS movies. I was in the hallway. Come to find out, the trailer was flipped, and the front door was the one nailed shut. Playing my Wii, and if you're curious, it was Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess to be exact. Something I need you all to note. We had no keys to this trailer. The only person with a set of keys was Mr. Dahl, so we were unable to ever lock the trailer when we left. As I was playing my game, right in front of the door that was locked, I saw the knob turn. No knocking, the knob jiggle, and our landlord tried to pry the door open twice, but was unable to do so successfully. I just froze and realized it was him, and he must have assumed that no one was home because our car was gone. But the door was locked, and I thought I was fine to continue playing my game. 11-year-old brain. My brother's in the living room, and we both heard this noise. At first, I thought it was a dog barking, and my brother heard it too. But the longer we listened, we realized it wasn't an animal, but the sound of people yelling. My brother went to the front door to investigate the noises, and me being a scared child, I followed right behind him. Both of my parents were standing out in the front yard. My mother was shouting at our landlord, who was sitting on a farming vehicle. Not sure what the name of it was. I remember it had a very long piece attached to it. She was visibly angry, and her voice was laced with rage. My father was yelling at him too, but I don't remember anything that was said exactly. My oldest brother asked what had happened, and here's how it goes. My parents pulled up to our trailer with their money order for rent. When they did, they caught Mr. Dahl backing up the farming vehicle against the door, the only exit in the trailer. My mother went into full protection mode, knowing her 2 children were stuck inside. She confronted him immediately. Luckily, he backed away from the door, but he was still operating his farm vehicle. I believe she threatened him, and they had an exchange of words. And he whipped the vehicle around fast and aggressively close to my mother, that he almost hit her with it. My parents were bewildered about what they had just witnessed. They didn't know what to do, and they called the police. When the police showed up, my parents explained the situation. It was no use because we had no legal agreement of renting out the trailer. The officer shrugged it off and said there was nothing they could do about anything, because no one was injured. Apparently, trapping 2 children inside of a trailer that's a fire hazard isn't illegal. We only spent one last night in that trailer. We no longer felt safe there, and we packed up as many things as we could in our car that we could. But unfortunately, we didn't have the money to rent a moving truck for the rest of our furniture. We stored the belongings we took with us at my grandparents' house, and we rented a motel room. It was about a week later after this happened when we tried going back for the rest of our belongings. We wanted no confrontation with Mr. Dahl, so we showed up to the trailer at night. It was dark inside and the porch light was off. My father and oldest brother went inside the trailer casually. Me and my mother and my older brother were waiting in the car. It was no less than 5 minutes when my father and oldest brother ran out of the trailer with speed I've never seen before. They hopped into the car and pulled out like there was a scene in an action movie while my mom was terrified and demanding answers. Apparently, they walked into the master bedroom first, which was an immediate right when you walk inside. They were going to grab a box of paperwork we had left behind when they left. They noticed something lying in the bed. Not just lying there asleep, but completely naked. It was Mr. Dahl, and right beside him was a gun. We never went back to that trailer. We never recovered the rest of our furniture that had sentimental value from family members, living and deceased. It's been almost a decade since that happened. My mother and I discuss it every now and then, but we're thankful that the time is behind us. I can't help but wonder if all that abandoned furniture was the result of some other unfortunate family who had to leave everything else behind, or had it been taken from them forcefully.
Hey friends, thanks for checking out today's video. If you haven't yet, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to be notified when I drop a new video or stream. If you guys want some more behind the scenes action, make sure to follow me on my social medias. Links to these will be provided in the description, including my public Discord. Also, if you would like to support me and the channel, please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon, where $1 a month gets you early access to all my videos. With all that being said, I want to thank you again, and remember to keep it spooky.